On certain nights in London, the fog seemed to think, lingering at the edge of the lamplight as though it were listening, as though the city itself were drawing a soft, slow breath and choosing not to exhale just yet. Tonight, we step into one of those quiet evenings, where the streets are blurred, the windows glow faintly, and time moves at a gentler pace. Welcome to quiet Ember sleep. Soft-spoken tales to slow the day's thoughts and carry you toward peaceful sleep. Before we begin, tell me where in the world you're listening from tonight, and, if you wish, what's resting at the edge of your thoughts. Now, settle in, get comfortable, and breathe with me as we begin. The streets lay under a soft gray veil, the kind of fog that did not fall in dramatic curtains, but gathered patiently, breath by breath, until the familiar corners and curbstones were gently erased. Gas lamps burned in small, determined halos. Their light thickened and made tangible, so that each lamp seemed to float in its own little room of pale gold, suspended in the larger darkness. Somewhere far off, the muffled clop of a cab horse's hooves came and went, close in one instant, curiously distant the next, as if the sound itself were feeling its way along the paving stones. This was the old London fog, though kinder tonight than on those notorious days when coal smoke and river mist joined forces to turn the air into something almost solid, a pea souper that could stain a collar and make a man lose his own doorstep. Now it moved with more courtesy, but the memory of those thicker shrouds still lived in the brickwork and the river's slow breath. And if one stood still and listened, one could almost hear the city remembering. Breathe with me as we begin to notice how the fog rests, how it waits. It curled itself around lampposts with the easy familiarity of a cat around an ankle, leaned against window panes as though eavesdropping on the soft clink of teacups and the low murmur of late conversations, and lingered in open doorways with an air of polite indecision, unsure whether to enter or remain outside. Along the Thames it tasted faintly of coal and river water, a cool dampness that settled on the skin and in the hair, beating on eyelashes until the whole world seemed to be viewed through a gently frosted window. Sound behaved oddly in such weather, as it always did in London's fogs. Footsteps emerged from the silence almost at one's elbow, and then faded again a few yards away. A distant ship's horn on the river might feel near enough to touch, while the creak of a signboard across the street became a suggestion rather than a certainty. These were the nights when stories grew in alleys, when a misplaced shadow could become, in the telling, a figure in a cloak. They were, in short, very good nights for soft-spoken tales to slow the day's thoughts. Imagine the city narrowing now, the wide sweep of riverfront and warehouse giving way, turn by quiet turn, to the more intimate pattern of familiar streets. From the Strand to Oxford Street, from Oxford Street to Marylebone, the fog folded itself into smaller and smaller rooms of air, until at last it reached that modest but famous thoroughfare, Baker Street. Here, the fog should have behaved like any other, drifting and thinning according to the faint currents between buildings. Yet on this particular night, it seemed to pause outside one address, as if consulting some private intention. It pressed more closely against a single upstairs window, lay thicker on a short stretch of pavement, and, most curious of all, refused to move on. Scotland Yard, when they finally took notice, would blame the weather. Holmes, watching from within that warmly lit room, already suspected that the weather, on this occasion, was only pretending. After all, what kind of fog keeps the same doorstep under guard for 3 nights in a row? Inside, the fog became a presence only at the edges, pressing its soft face against the window panes of 221B, while the room itself held to its own older weather. The coal fire burned low in the grate, a compact, steady glow rather than a blaze, breathing out a quiet warmth that gathered in the threadbare carpet, the worn arms of the chairs, and the familiar haze of tobacco that seemed as permanent a fixture as the walls themselves. The sitting room had the look it always assumed on such nights, that particular arrangement of disorder which, to a stranger, might suggest neglect, but to its occupants spoke of work in progress. On the table by the window, yesterday's chemical reagents stood in a shy little row of cloudy bottles. On the mantel, a stray scrap of telegram paper curled beside the Persian slipper that held Holmes's tobacco. Across the hearthrug, a fan of case notes lay where they had been dropped, each page covered in his angular hand, arrows and underlinings marching like tiny regiments toward some undisclosed conclusion. The only sound for long stretches was the ticking of the clock on the mantel, that small, stubborn heartbeat of the room, joined now and then by the soft click of cooling coal or the distant muffled roll of a cab's wheels somewhere below. It was a silence that did not feel empty so much as attentive, like a listener leaning in. You might notice how that kind of silence can be more companionable than speech. Holmes lay stretched at length upon the sofa, his long frame making the piece of furniture appear slightly apologetic for its own dimensions. His dressing gown, a faded, once opulent thing of indeterminate color, hung a little askew, one lapel folded under the other as if it had lost an argument with gravity. His fingers were steepled beneath his chin, the familiar gesture of suspended action, and though his eyes were half closed, lids lowered as if sleep were being considered. There was in the set of his mouth and the faint rhythmic movement of one foot the unmistakable evidence that every faculty was quietly alert. Watson, for his part, occupied his usual armchair, that respectable, slightly battered stronghold to the right of the fire, with the evening paper folded over one knee, and a medical journal attempting without much success to command his attention. He had learned over their years of friendship and shared lodgings to recognize the texture of Holmes's repose, and tonight's posture, though outwardly indolent, carried precisely that undertone of listening which always made Watson's own thoughts fall into a kind of watchful order. The air held the layered scent he knew so well, the sharp, almost metallic tang of Holmes's tobacco, the drier, bookish smell of old paper and leather, and underneath it all the faint mineral breath of London's fog seeping in at the sash, as though the city itself were trying to eavesdrop. Holmes seemed in truth to be returning the compliment, for every so often his head would tilt almost imperceptibly toward the window, as if he were attending not to the room, but to the thickness of the night beyond the glass. Was it entirely fanciful, Watson wondered, to imagine that he was listening to the fog itself, weighing its silence as another man might weigh testimony? These were the hours that Watson in later years would remember with a peculiar tenderness, the late-night conversations that began with some trivial remark about a patient or a headline, and wandered unhurried through philosophy, chemistry, and the oddities of human nature. The shared silences in which no word was required to affirm the steady presence of the other. The way a case would sometimes announce itself not with a dramatic knock, but with a single, offhand observation from Holmes that turned the whole evening on its axis. They were soft-spoken tales to slow the day's thoughts, even when the tales were not yet written, only waiting in the air between them. Tonight the rhythm was the same, and that sameness was, in itself, a kind of comfort. Holmes on the sofa, apparently idle yet, measuring the city's breathing. Watson in his chair, half reading, half composing in his mind, the phrases with which he might one day describe this very scene. The fire a low companion, the clock a patient metronome. Outside, the peculiar fog kept its post at the chosen doorstep. Inside, two old friends occupied their familiar stations, held in that gentle pause before the conductor's baton falls. Breathe with me as we begin to linger in that pause, because London's strangest stories so often choose such quiet rooms on such quiet nights from which to rise and carry you toward peaceful sleep, and, just occasionally, toward danger. Watson would later say that it was not any sound that first told him this night would be different, but the way the fog looked on the glass. The window of the familiar sitting room had, on many a London evening, worn a faint, blurred halo, the ordinary breathing of the city pressing softly against it. Yet tonight the panes seemed to bear a weight, a pale, dense film that clung and would not release, as though the fog had forgotten that its task was to drift and thin and move along. He rose once, under the pretext of adjusting the curtain, and found himself studying the moisture-beaded surface with a quiet frown, tracing with his gaze the slow, reluctant slide of a single droplet, like a thought that refused to resolve itself into words. Inside, the warmth of the fire held the room in a gentle embrace, that particular mixture of coal glow, pipe smoke, and worn upholstery that had become, to Watson, nearly as soothing as a lullaby. One could almost hear the armchairs say, as the clock on the mantel marked out the seconds of a night that seemed in no haste to pass. Holmes lay extended on the sofa, his long fingers steepled, his eyes half closed. The profile so familiar that Watson's mind could wander without losing sight of him. And yet, even in that relaxed attitude, there was a faint tension at the corner of the mouth, a suggestion that some small inner mechanism had begun to turn. "London is my laboratory, Watson," Holmes murmured at last, without opening his eyes, his voice low enough that it scarcely disturbed the soft silence of the room. "And the weather is its most capricious assistant. Tonight, I fancy, the experiment is behaving oddly." There was no drama in the words, only that dry, almost amused inflection that Watson had come to recognize as the earliest hint of genuine interest, as if the city itself had placed some curious specimen upon the slide and was waiting to see whether he would notice. Watson turned again toward the window. The gas light from the street, which on clearer nights etched the outlines of passing cabs and umbrellaed figures upon the glass, had been reduced to a diffused, milky glow, so that the window no longer offered any view of Baker Street at all, but merely presented itself as a pale, luminous rectangle, hovering at the edge of the room like a door left ajar into nothing. The familiar silhouettes, lamp-post opposite eaves, the occasional bobbing hat, were gone, swallowed whole, and it gave him the faint, unreasonable impression that if he were to open the sash, his hand would meet not cold night air, but something thicker, almost tangible. For a time neither man spoke. The fire settled upon itself with the occasional soft crackle, a coal giving way and sending up a brief golden flutter that painted Holmes's face in warm relief before subsiding again into embers. Somewhere beyond the fog, a carriage passed, its wheels rattling over the stones in a strangely muffled cadence, as though the sound had been wrapped in wool before being allowed to enter the room. The horses' hooves, usually so crisp in their rhythm, reached them as a distant, padded thud more felt than heard. These were soft-spoken tales to slow the day's thoughts, the ordinary noises of London at night, yet even they seemed to respect some unseen boundary at the very edge of the glass. Watson found, to his mild surprise, that he was listening not only to the city, but to the silence between those sounds, measuring unconsciously the intervals as though he expected some new note to enter the composition. The fog, he reflected, had always been London's accomplice in mystery, thickening the shadows in which crime or romance might equally shelter, but it was usually a restless accomplice, drifting, thinning, gathering again in corners and alley mouths. Tonight, it appeared to have chosen Baker Street, and then, like a patient watcher, simply remained. "Curious," he said at last, more to himself than to Holmes, his tone almost idle, as if commenting on the quality of the tea. "The fog outside has not shifted for hours. It is as if the night itself were holding its breath." Holmes's eyes opened then, very slowly, the gray irises catching the firelight, and Watson had the sudden quiet certainty that somewhere out in that motionless whiteness, something, or someone, was waiting for them to notice. The knock, when it came, did not so much sound through the room as arrive, as if it had been obliged to push its way through the dense waiting fog outside, squeezing between damp layers, until only the softest remnant of the original impulse could reach our ears. Watson, who had been listening to the quiet tick of the clock and the low, companionable murmur of the fire, almost wondered if he had imagined it. It was a knock wrapped in woolen silence, curiously muffled, like the memory of a sound rather than the thing itself, and for a heartbeat the room seemed to hold its breath in answer. Holmes did not start, or call out, or even sit forward. Instead, his head tilted a fraction, the gray eyes brightening with that quick, inward light Watson knew so well, as though some private expectation had just been confirmed, as though the night, having been challenged, had at last made its move. There was another of those oddly padded raps, and then the familiar measured tread upon the stairs, accompanied by the faint rustle of skirts and the almost musical clink of crockery on a small tray. The domestic orchestra that signaled Mrs. Walland, Hudson long before she reached the door. She entered with her usual gentle composure, wiping her hands on her apron in that automatic gesture of one forever moving between kitchen and sitting room, between the warmth of the stove and the quieter warmth of our fire. And she cast a brief glance toward the window, where the fog pressed like a curious cat against the glass. "It is a thick one tonight, gentlemen," she observed softly, her voice respectful of the late hour, so thick you could almost slice it if you had the patience. And on the small tray she carried, beside a modest refreshment she had clearly decided we ought to have whether we knew it or not, there lay a single, crinkled envelope. Watson's gaze went to it at once, drawn less by any dramatic instinct than by the simple contrast of its stiff, pale surface against the darker wood of the tray, and he noticed how the paper had bowed slightly, the corners turned and roughened, as if it had endured a journey through pockets and hands and damp London air. The ink upon it, once neat and uncompromising, now showed the faint blur that comes when moisture has lingered too long, the letters still legible but softened at their edges, as if the fog itself had tried to read the message and, failing, had contented itself with smudging the attempt. Along the margins, a fine line of dampness remained, not enough to stain, merely enough to cool the fingertips when Watson took it up, and that small chill, against the background of the room's cultivated warmth, made him oddly aware of the distance between the quiet here and whatever weathered errand had sent this telegram to Baker Street. Holmes accepted the tray with a slight inclination of the head, his fingers resting for a moment on the envelope without opening it, as though listening to some inner clock, and Watson, watching him, felt that familiar, gentle stirring of curiosity rise within him like steam from a teacup, tempered by the late hour, by the steady crackle of the fire, by the soothing, almost hypnotic ticking that marked out London's sleepless seconds. He had learned, over the years, that not every message arriving after dark heralded catastrophe. Some brought puzzles as delicate as watchwork, others the quieter dramas of ordinary souls, and in that balance lay much of the comfort of their life together. Those soft-spoken tales to slow the day's thoughts rather than to shatter them. "Settle in, get comfortable," he might have said to any unseen listener had there been one, for the scene held all the elements he associated with the gentler sort of adventure. The fog at the window, the fire in the grate, Holmes poised at the edge of interest, and himself between sleep and wakefulness, ready to be carried wherever the next small mystery might lead. As Holmes at last slipped a finger beneath the dampened flap, Watson drew a slow breath, almost unconsciously matching it to the rhythm of the clock, and wondered, not with alarm, but with a quiet, almost drowsy anticipation, what corner of London's thinking fog would drift into their room tonight. Breathe with me as we begin to follow it, and let this modest knock, so carefully muffled by the night, carry you toward peaceful sleep even as it opens the door to the case. The knock, when it came, was almost apologetic, a soft tapping that seemed reluctant to disturb the fog-heavy silence of the house, and for a moment Watson fancied that even the sound paused upon the threshold, uncertain whether to intrude upon the warm little room with its fire and its familiar clutter. Holmes lifted his head, not with a start, but with the mild curiosity of a man who has already calculated 3 likely explanations and is merely waiting to see which will have the politeness to present itself. "Mrs. Hudson will answer," Watson began. But even as he spoke, there came the faint creak of the stair and the rustle of paper, and a moment later their landlady herself appeared, a telegram upon a small tray, as though it were a fragile piece of china that might take offense at being handled too roughly. Holmes accepted it with a slight inclination of the head, and for a few heartbeats he did not open it. He merely weighed it in his long fingers, as if feeling not the thickness of the paper, but the urgency pressed into it by an anxious hand. "You observe, Watson," he said at last, in that quiet, lecturing tone that managed to be both affectionate and faintly amused, that the modern world has contrived a mechanism by which other people's panic may be transmitted at the speed of electricity. A telegram is rarely the servant of reason. It is, more often, the herald of someone else's inability to wait. He smiled, the expression flickering like the reflection of the fire in the window glass. "I confess I prefer the slower pace of facts walking to my door, rather than racing along wires in their shirt sleeves. Still," and here he broke the seal with a neat movement, "we must allow the century its toys, Watson. Let us see what tempest seeks to enlist us tonight." He unfolded the flimsy sheet, his gray eyes taking on that still intensity that always made Watson unconsciously lean forward and read aloud in an even voice that somehow made the words more striking for their lack of drama. "From Tobias Gregson, Scotland Yard. Begged to consult you informally. Unusual atmospheric occurrence in Bloomsbury. Single street off Russell Square where fog has not lifted for 3 nights, despite clear conditions elsewhere. Local complaints increasing. Yard meteorological advisors unconcerned. Attribute to natural causes. I am not satisfied. Request your opinion before matter becomes public curiosity. Died. The fire popped softly, a coal giving way, and outside, the muffled rattle of wheels on damp cobblestone reminded them that London went on, indifferent to the oddities of its own weather. Watson took the telegram when Holmes passed it across, reading it again, this time letting the phrases settle more slowly in his mind, like flakes of soot drifting down through lamplight. A street, he murmured, that refuses to share the city's climate. It sounds, on the face of it, like no more than an obstinate pocket of London fog, and yet 3 nights in one confined place, while the rest of the town clears? He hesitated, feeling a small, not unpleasant shiver that had nothing to do with the temperature. It has a touch, Holmes, of the supernatural pamphlet about it, the sort of thing one finds in those little shilling booklets at the railway bookstall, the cursed street of Bloomsbury, and yet Gregson is not given to flights of fancy. Holmes had risen and was standing by the window, looking not so much at the fog as through it, as though it were a veil over some intricate mechanism only he could see. The room held a soft, companionable silence, broken only by the quiet tick of the clock and the distant call of a newsboy. "Supernatural, my dear Watson," he said at last, "is a word we apply when our ignorance wishes to preserve its dignity. Weather is a large and unruly phenomenon, but it does not, in my experience, consult street plans, obey timetables, or respect property boundaries." He turned back, the familiar, gentle brightness of inquiry awakening in his face. "If the fog has elected to linger in one small corner of London, then it has had assistance. And assistance implies intention. Breathe with me as we begin to consider what kind of mind would choose to manufacture a private piece of night in the middle of Bloomsbury." Watson felt, as he often did at such moments, the curious, quiet thrill of standing on the threshold of the unknown, not in danger but in anticipation, as though the city itself were drawing back a curtain to reveal some modest stage prepared especially for them. Outside, the fog pressed itself more closely against the glass, and the street beyond their window seemed to recede, becoming not less real, but more secret. Soft-spoken tales to slow the day's thoughts, Watson reflected wryly, had an odd way of beginning with a simple knock and a few spare words on a flimsy sheet of paper. Holmes folded the telegram once more and slipped it into his pocket with the care one might give to a key whose lock was not yet known. "We shall visit this recalcitrant street tomorrow evening, Watson," he said. "London wishes to play a little game with us. It would be ungracious not to accept." And with that gentle promise hanging in the warm air of the room, the fire settling, the fog thickening and the city quietly rearranging its secrets in the dark, the case of the fog-bound street waited, patient and impenetrable, just beyond their door, ready to carry you toward peaceful sleep even as it drew them out into the night. The invitation itself, when Holmes finally read it aloud, proved as soft and spare as the fog that had inspired it, yet its few words seemed to thicken the very air of the room. Inspector Gregson requested, with uncharacteristic urgency, that Holmes attend a certain riverside street before dawn, a narrow lane pressed between a row of warehouses and the slow black ribbon of the Thames. It was, Holmes observed, one of those unlovely corners of London that the city preferred to forget, except when it required coal or cargo or quiet places in which inconvenient things might be moved without comment. The telegram named it precisely, giving the number of a warehouse door, the angle at which the lane met the river stairs, and a stipulation that Holmes arrive while the lamps still burned pale in the fog and the first carts of morning had not yet begun to rattle over the stones. "Settle in, get comfortable," I murmured almost reflexively in my own mind, as if I could persuade the case to wait until a more civilized hour, but the city beyond the window had other ideas. Gregson reported that the fog had lingered over that single street for 3 nights, while the rest of London cleared, and that local residents, with the quiet efficiency of those accustomed to oddities, had already named it cursed. They said, that the deeper one walked into it, the quieter London became, until the omnipresent rumble of the metropolis, hooves, wheels, distant shouts, the river's own soft slap against the embankment, fell away, as though a great hand had drawn a woolen blanket over the city's mouth. A woman on the top floor of a lodging house swore she had watched a lamplighter vanish into the whiteness, his pole and ladder swallowed to the last inch, while the flame he carried seemed to dim as if sleep had taken it mid-step. Holmes, pipe now sending up its own miniature weather system, began to outline the geography with the same care he might have given a chemical formula. From Baker Street, they would take a cab eastward, skirting the sleeping squares, then down toward the river where the air always held a different density, touched by tar, rope, and the faint metallic breath of the Thames. The warehouses, he reminded Watson, were supplied by factories whose chimneys fed London's famous pea soupers. Coal smoke, industrial fumes, and river mist could, under the right conditions, linger in strange configurations. Watson, ever the practical man, and at this hour a man with a warm chair and a better fire, raised the obvious concerns. Visibility would be poor. The lane close to the docks was no stranger to petty crime. The hour, sliding steadily toward midnight, was not one in which a medical man would advise unnecessary exertion. Yet even as he spoke, he knew the gentle futility of his objections. Holmes listened with that serene, almost affectionate inattention that told Watson his mind was already walking the route, measuring each cobblestone. To Holmes, the fog was obstacle and invitation both, a curtain drawn not merely to conceal, but to announce that something behind it wished, paradoxically, to be found. "Breathe with me as we begin," he said lightly, drawing on his coat, "for London will be holding hers." He decided, with the calm finality that brooked no appeal, that they would attend the street that very night, for there was no better time to meet a mystery than when it believed itself unseen. And as he reached to snuff the lamp, leaving only the low fire and the pale smear of fog at the window, a distant, muffled sound, neither river, nor wheel, nor voice, seemed to rise from the direction of the docks, as though the cursed street had heard him, and was already answering. The sound seemed to fade back into the city's endless murmur, leaving only the soft ticking of the clock and the low, steady whisper of the fire as it settled upon itself. Yet in that small, familiar room the decision had already been made. The fog might circle and brood outside, but within 221B, the pattern of preparation unfolded with the quiet inevitability of a well-loved ritual. Holmes rose first. It was always so. The movement was unhurried, almost languid. Yet Watson knew, as you and I might know a dear friend's smallest habits, that every gesture concealed a precise intention. Holmes reached for his long, dark coat from the stand by the door, the fabric catching a stray glimmer from the fire, and then for the soft, worn scarf that had accompanied them through more London nights than Watson could easily number. The fog pressed itself against the window as if to watch, pale and patient, while Holmes's thin fingers made an efficient business of buttons and folds. Watson, for his part, glanced down at his watch, more from ingrained habit than necessity, the little silver case cool against his palm, the hands marking the hour with the same calm indifference with which they had watched over so many shared departures. He had learned over their years of friendship and shared lodgings that there was a peculiar comfort in these repetitions, the reaching for hat and gloves, the checking of time, the soft creak of well-worn leather as he bent to retrieve his cane. In such moments, the unknown beyond the door seemed to draw back a little, as though even mystery respected punctuality. Behind them, from the direction of the kitchen, came the faint, homely rattle of crockery and the gentle sigh of the kettle, still keeping its own promise of warmth. Mrs. Hudson appeared at the doorway, wiping her hands on her apron, her expression a mixture of resignation and quiet concern that had not altered since their very first late-night expedition. "You'll be needing the umbrella, Doctor," she observed with that practical wisdom which took London's moods as seriously as any diagnosis. "Fog like this never comes alone." Holmes accepted the umbrella with a slight inclination of his head, but his eyes, bright and amused, had already drifted to the drawer where Watson kept his revolver. "I presume, my dear Watson," he said, in that light tone which suggested both teasing and genuine regard, "that your faithful companion is in his usual state of readiness? I should be loath to discover that only the fog is armed this evening." Watson gave a small, indulgent snort, checking the familiar weight before slipping it into his pocket, more for form than from any expectation of its use. The truth, which he would have confessed only in such soft-spoken tales to slow the day's thoughts, was that the presence of Holmes at his side had always done more to steady his nerves than any metal or mechanism. There had been many nights when they had stepped out into London's darkness together, to the river docks where the Thames moved in quiet, secretive curves, to gaslit alleys where the fog turned every lamp into a blurred halo, to rooms where fear sat in the corners like a patient guest, yet always with Holmes beside him, the city's shadows seemed less like threats and more like puzzles waiting courteously to be solved. He thought of the time they had crossed the city in a snowstorm to catch the mail train, of the Alpine Express and its muffled wheels, of how Holmes's calm presence had turned even a locked compartment and a vanished man into something that could be held and examined. Tonight's mystery, a single street wrapped in a fog that would not lift, felt of a piece with those earlier enigmas, and Watson found that his pulse, though awake, was not troubled. You may feel that same quiet reassurance now, and imagine the scene with me. Holmes took up his hat, pausing only to adjust the lamp so that the room would retain a pool of gentle light in their absence, as though the fire and the chairs and the scattered papers might continue their own private conversation until the pair returned. Mrs. Hudson hovered a moment longer, then, with a soft, "Mind how you go, gentlemen," retreated to the comforting clink and simmer of her domain. At last they stood together in the narrow hallway, where the air was cooler and the sounds of the street came through in muted fragments, the distant roll of a carriage, the echo of a closing door, the almost inaudible hush of the fog moving along the pavement. Holmes's hand rested on the latch. Watson, beside him, felt that familiar, curious blend of anticipation and calm, as if the very act of stepping out with this man turned uncertainty into a kind of quiet adventure. "Ready, Watson?" Holmes asked, though they both knew the answer. The front door opened with a soft, well-oiled sigh, and at once the world beyond presented itself not as a street, but as a wall of pale, waiting fog, so dense that the nearest gas lamp was reduced to a vague, shrouded glow. For a single heartbeat they paused together on the threshold, two dark figures framed by the warm rectangle of the room behind, and the cool, inscrutable whiteness before, as if London itself were holding its breath, deciding what or whom it would allow them to see once they stepped forward. Holmes moved first. The decision, when it came, was as soft and inevitable as the settling of ash in a cooling grate, and with that slight forward inclination of his narrow shoulders, the knight seemed to accept their choice and close around them. They stepped down from the familiar threshold of 221B, boots finding the stone with a muted certainty, And almost at once Baker Street began to withdraw, not with drama, but with the quiet confidence of something that knew it would be there when they returned. Within a half-dozen paces, the comforting geometry of railings and doorsteps had melted into a uniform whiteness, so that the nearest gas lamp no longer revealed its iron post or glass panes, but hung instead as a pale, floating halo, suspended in the fog like a thought not yet put into words. Another few steps, and even that halo grew faint, until they walked, as Watson later reflected, not so much in a street as in a softly lit room whose walls refused to declare themselves. Sound, too, altered its character. Their own footsteps, which in clear weather rang out crisply on the pavement, now returned to them as a subdued echo, wrapped in layers of moisture, each fall of leather on stone cushioned by the invisible air. Somewhere ahead? Or was it behind? A carriage passed, but the clatter of wheels on cobblestone and the measured beat of hooves arrived strangely bodiless, as though the vehicle were no more than a memory London was idly revisiting. From an unseen eave, a slow, patient drip kept time, each drop meeting the flagstones with a tiny note that seemed almost too distinct for such a smothered night. "Breathe with me as we begin," the narrator in me might whisper to you now, if you were there beside them, invited to walk at their unhurried pace, for this was one of those soft-spoken tales to slow the day's thoughts, even as the city itself appeared to doze. Holmes, who disliked relying on impressions when an experiment could be contrived, came to a halt near where he judged the curb ought to be. He drew out his matchbox, its familiar rasp sounding oddly intimate in the muffled silence, and struck a flame. The small tongue of fire flared, its warmth kissing Watson's cheek, and for a brief moment the fog recoiled, revealing a tiny sphere of clearer air about them. Holmes extended his arm full length. "Observe, Watson," he murmured. "We shall let London measure itself." Watson, ever obedient to such requests, counted under his breath. 1, 2, 3. The match still shone, a modest star in their private firmament. 4, 5. The light dulled, its edges blurring as if tired. 6. The flame remained, but now as a mere suggestion, a memory of brightness rather than its fact. By 7 it had been entirely swallowed, though Watson knew from the minute warmth upon his hand that the match still burned. Holmes shook it out with a small economical gesture. "You perceive," he said quietly, "that visibility is not merely reduced, it is capriciously arranged. An ordinary London fog, even a so-called pea souper, would hardly behave with quite such discretion." The last word carried a faint wry amusement, as if the weather had committed a social faux pas. As they resumed their slow progress, Watson became aware of the physical intimacy of the mist. Tiny beads of moisture had gathered upon Holmes's dark hair, silvering it at the temples in a way that made him look, for a moment, older and oddly, like a professor recalled from his books to settle some question the world could not answer for itself. Droplets clung to the shoulders of his coat, tracing darkened seams, and when Watson lifted a gloved hand to his own face, the air felt cool and clean against his skin, yet carried with it a faint tang of coal smoke and something riverine, as though the Thames had sent up a ghost of itself to wander the higher streets. There was, too, a smell of damped stone and distant chimneys, the usual perfume of London at such an hour, yet arranged in a pattern that Watson could not quite name. The fog pressed gently against his lips when he breathed, so that each inhalation felt like sipping thin, chill milk through the quiet. On certain nights, Holmes observed, more to the fog than to his companion, one has the impression that London is conducting an experiment of its own. This, I think, is such a night. It is no ordinary accumulation of river vapor and coal smoke. It has intention, or at least the appearance of it. He fell silent again, as if unwilling to startle the whiteness with too many words at once. Watson, glancing back, found that the doorway of 221B had already vanished, the warm rectangle of light erased as completely as chalk from a schoolroom slate. Only the vaguest glow marked where the nearest lamp might be, and beyond that, nothing at all. For the first time he understood how a man might step into such a street and fail, quite sincerely, to find his way out again. A sudden, sharper sound intruded, the ring of metal against stone, brief and precise, somewhere off to their right. It was gone almost before Watson could register it, leaving the quiet thicker than before, as though the fog resented the interruption. He turned his head, but saw only the same soft, impenetrable whiteness. "Curious," Holmes murmured. "London rarely wastes a sound without purpose." His tone held no alarm, only that mild interest which Watson knew was the first stirring of the great machine of his mind. "Come, my dear fellow, let us see how far this obliging curtain is prepared to follow us." And so they went on, two dark figures moving through a world reduced to a few yards of pavement, the whisper of their own footsteps, and a fog that seemed, in its quiet way, to be listening. The city began, almost imperceptibly, to loosen its familiar grip as they walked, the comforting geometry of the West End giving way to streets whose names Watson knew only from newspapers and Holmes's more nocturnal expeditions. Step by unhurried step, the lamps grew sparser, the houses lower and more withdrawn from the pavement, and the fog, which had been a companionable veil around shop fronts and bright windows, thickened into a more secretive presence, as though it, too, were aware they were leaving the well-lit rooms of London's evening behind. Holmes moved with the same quiet certainty he might have shown in their own sitting room, crossing from curb to curb, turning down alleys that to Watson appeared indistinguishable, and pausing now and then, not in doubt, but with the air of a man taking a bearing from something only he could see. A faint change in the glow of a gas lamp, the dimmer blot of a church tower somewhere above the fog, the echo of their footfalls against brick rather than stone. These, it seemed, were as clear to him as signposts by daylight. Watson, settling his collar against the damp, reflected that one might, if one wished, call it uncanny, but to Holmes it was merely London speaking in a softer voice. As they drew nearer the river, the very breath of the fog altered. What had been a kind of woolen warmth about their faces became cooler, finer, threaded with the unmistakable tang of the Thames, wet rope and tar, old wood that had known 1,000 tides. And that faint metallic suggestion that always hung over the water, as though the river kept some quiet memory of every anchor chain it had ever lifted. The air felt less like a blanket and more like a slow, patient tide of its own, flowing up from the unseen embankment to meet them. "Notice, Watson," Holmes murmured, as if continuing a conversation begun an hour before, "how the city announces its industries to the nose long before the eye is permitted to confirm the matter." Watson smiled into the mist. He could indeed smell beneath the river's breath the ghost of spices, tobacco, and far-off climates, all diluted now into a single damp perfume. These docks, he knew, had once made London the counting-house of the world. With cargoes from India, Africa, the Americas, all passing through a maze of warehouses and cranes, and it was among these same sheds and shadowed wharves that so many of Holmes's more obscure clients had come to grief or fortune. He remembered as they walked a case of smuggled opium hidden in barrels of lamp oil, another of forged bills of lading that had nearly ruined a respectable firm, and more than one occasion when a body had been found. No, he corrected himself with a small inward shiver when a mystery had been discovered, floating near a mooring ring. The river, for all its quiet, was a tireless accomplice to small-time criminals and smugglers, and the fog, on nights like this, seemed almost to conspire with them, offering secrecy in exchange for silence. Here, the sounds of London altered as surely as the air. The distant rumble of cabs and omnibuses fell away behind them, replaced by the low, intermittent creak of moored boats shifting against their ropes. The soft slap of water against stone steps and hulls, and now and then a shout from some unseen deck, so muffled by the mist that it might have been a dream of a voice rather than the thing itself. Between these small disturbances lay stretches of near complete quiet, so that Watson found his own breathing unexpectedly loud in his ears, and the measured tap of Holmes's cane on the pavement took on a kind of metronomic authority. If you're listening to this with your own room dimmed and the world outside your window held at bay, you might almost hear that river silence yourself, that peculiar blend of distance and intimacy that can carry you toward peaceful sleep. These are the soft-spoken tales to slow the day's thoughts, and London on such a night seemed determined to speak in undertones. The lamps grew fewer still, and the fog, oddly, appeared denser ahead than around them, pooling in certain hollows of the street as if drawn there by some invisible current. Great shapes began to loom out of that concentrated whiteness. The blunt shoulders of warehouses with their shuttered loading doors, the stiff silhouettes of cranes frozen in attitudes of perpetual labor against the sky, and, leading between them, the outline of a narrow street, so choked with mist that it seemed to hold more fog than the air surrounding it, like a vessel filled to the brim and waiting, very quietly, to be entered. For a moment we simply stood and looked at it, as one might pause before an unfamiliar room, with the door already half open, feeling that the air beyond would be of a different temperature from the corridor behind. The fog in the dockside lanes around us was thick enough, a respectable London murk that blurred the gas lamps and set a soft halo about each window, but this narrow street ahead seemed to possess a density all its own, as though someone had poured an extra measure of mist into it and forgotten to stop. Holmes took the first step, and the change was almost immediate. One pace, and the vapor was the ordinary kind, carrying the faint odor of the river and coal smoke. A second pace, and it was as if we had crossed an invisible threshold. The air turning cooler and more saturated, the fog drawing itself together into slow, deliberate eddies that curled about our ankles and wrists with a curious, almost tactile insistence. The sounds of London, the distant roll of wheels, the muted call of a cabman, the lap of water against the wharf, fell away not in any sudden fashion, but by degrees, like a door being very gently closed in another room. Behind us, when I glanced back, the world still existed. I could see, in a softened way, the outline of the broader quay, the taller lamps burning with their familiar yellow smear, the suggestion of movement where a late cart trundled by. Ahead, the lamps became no more than smudged coins, their light swallowed within a few yards, their posts vanishing into a gray that felt almost material, as if one might reach out and press a hand against it and find resistance. At the very edge of this altered region, a small knot of figures had gathered, like parishioners uncertain whether to enter an untried church. 3 men, wrapped in greatcoats with their collars turned up, and a woman with a shawl drawn close about her face, stood with their backs to the clearer air, their boots planted just shy of the line where the fog grew more intent. 2 held lanterns, but the light they cast was meager, each flame surrounded by a short, blurred halo that seemed to push no further than an arm's length before surrendering. "Evening, sir," one of the men murmured as we approached, his voice instinctively quiet, as if the fog might resent anything louder. He had the look of a watchman about him, with a brass badge dulled by damp and a cap pulled low. "You'll be the gentleman from Baker Street, then. We was told you'd come." Holmes inclined his head, his features softened by the dimness into an arrangement I knew well, the mild curiosity that never quite concealed the intensity beneath. "You sent the telegram?" he asked. The man shook his head and gestured toward the woman, who stepped half a pace forward, though her feet did not cross that uncertain boundary. "My brother keeps a warehouse halfway down," she said, fingers tightening on the edge of her shawl. "3 nights now, Doctor, it's been like this. The rest of the river clears when the wind comes up. You can see the lamps on the bridge again, hear the steamers call. But this bit here," she nodded toward the waiting street, "it doesn't stir, not an inch, not since Monday." Holmes's eyes narrowed slightly, catching, I knew, on the precise timetable. Weather, as he had remarked more than once, does not usually consult Bradshaw. "Has no one tried to pass through?" I asked, though the answer was evident in their collective posture. "We go as far as the corner," the watchman replied, "to see if the doors is secure. No further. Sound goes queer in there. Your own footsteps don't come back right. And there's a feel to it." He hesitated, and in the pause the fog between the houses seemed to pulse with its own quiet, like the streets holding its breath. There was a soft, almost domestic quality to the silence that followed, as if the city itself were waiting for Holmes's decision, the way a sitting room waits for someone to cross from the window to the fire. I found myself thinking, somewhat incongruously, of those evenings at Baker Street when the clock ticked toward midnight and the case hovered on the edge of becoming clear, and how I would tell you later, in these soft-spoken tales to slow the day's thoughts, about the exact instant when he chose to step forward, settle in, get comfortable. I might say then, inviting you to breathe with me as we begin. But there on the quay, my breath felt oddly constrained, as though the fog itself were testing its weight upon my chest. Holmes drew his coat more closely about him, not in any gesture of unease, but with the air of a man adjusting his instruments before entering a laboratory. "Very well," he said quietly. "If the street will not come to us, Watson, we must go to the street." With that, he stepped across the invisible line. Within 3 paces his outline blurred. Within 5 he was reduced to a taller shadow among the shifting grays. And then, with a kind of decorous slowness, the fog accepted him entirely, closing over his retreating form, until only the faintest disturbance of the vapor hinted at his passage. For a heartbeat I remained where I was, feeling the ordinary world at my back, and this altered one before me, like a man standing between waking and sleep, uncertain which direction to choose. The lantern beside me guttered, its flame bowing toward the denser mist as if drawn. "Doctor?" the woman said softly. Holmes was no longer visible. His footsteps had already melted into the strange, muffled quiet of that street that refused the dawn, and there was nothing for it but to follow him into the waiting silence. The street received me with a quiet so complete that for a moment I wondered whether I had stepped not merely away from the woman and her lantern, but out of London altogether, into some suspended room of air that belonged to no city at all. The fog closed gently around my shoulders, soft as wool laid over a sleeper's chest, and the familiar chorus of the metropolis fell away behind me, like a door eased to. There should have been hooves. Even at that hour, some late cab or dray, some impatient driver calling to his horse, some distant bell from a river steamer or a church tower marking the slow procession of the night. Instead, there was only the faint scuff of my own boots, the small creak of leather at my knees, and as I drew nearer to Holmes's shadow, the paired rhythm of our breathing, a quiet duet in a city suddenly shy of sound. "Holmes," I began, meaning to ask whether we had not perhaps misjudged the hour or the turning, but the single word fell oddly flat between us, as if I had spoken into a room hung with heavy curtains. My voice did not carry, it seemed to move no farther than my own lips before the fog received it, absorbed it, and allowed nothing back but a dull impression that I had disturbed something that preferred to remain still. I tried again, more loudly, and yet even then the syllables felt padded, deprived of their usual crisp edges, like a bell struck under water. Holmes, who had not paused, lifted one hand in a small gesture that might equally have been reassurance or request for silence, and I noticed how the moisture clung differently along the wall we were passing. On one stretch of brick the beads lay fine and even, a delicate sheen that caught what little light the muffled gas lamps could offer, while 2 doors farther on the droplets had gathered into heavier, irregular trails, as though some invisible breath had passed there more recently and in greater quantity. He bent for a moment, gloved fingers hovering close to the surface without quite touching, his head inclined in that bird-like way of his that always suggested a mind alighting on some new perch of observation. "There," he murmured, more to himself than to me. "Note the soot." I peered, grateful for any excuse to focus on solid brick rather than the shifting pale about us. The pattern was indeed peculiar, not the uniform grime that London bestows impartially on all its buildings, but a faint, fan-shaped darkening above a narrow side passage, as if some hidden chimney had been exhaling into the fog. Beneath it, the smell of the river, tar, wet wood, that metallic damp one associates with the Thames at night, was overlaid by something sharper, a thread of chemicals that pricked at the back of the throat without quite declaring its nature. "Do you perceive it, Watson?" Holmes asked softly. "The city's own exhalation is one thing. This is another." Now that he drew my attention to it, I could not help but notice that the fog thickened in slow, almost visible folds near certain doorways and the mouths of narrow alleys, as if it had chosen favorite corners in which to linger. One lamppost stood in comparatively open air, its glow reaching the cobbles with modest success, while 10 paces farther on, its twin was wrapped to the very glass in a milky sheath that turned the flame within to a mere pale ghost of light. It was not the even, impartial spread of a natural mist. It gathered and pooled, clung and retreated, as though obeying lines of influence that had nothing to do with wind or river. "London has many laboratories," Holmes remarked, almost conversationally. "It appears we have walked into one of them." He moved on with unhurried steps, and I followed, the silence deepening around us until even our footfalls seemed reluctant to announce themselves. Somewhere beyond the white veil, a cart might have rumbled, a dog might have barked, a watchman might have coughed, yet none of these reached us. We were enclosed in a soft, listening stillness that pressed close without malice, but with a curious, expectant patience. Holmes came to a halt so gently that I almost collided with him. He stood quite still, head tilted at a slight angle, one hand half raised, as though the air itself had spoken his name. In that moment, the fog seemed to lean inward, the silence drawing tight as a held breath. I listened with all the earnestness of a man straining for the reassuring clatter of ordinary life, but heard nothing at all. Nothing, that is, save the quiet, intent attention of Holmes, fixed upon some sound or absence of sound that lay wholly beyond my perception, and yet would, I felt, carry us one step nearer to the heart of this strange, sleepless mist that would not lift, and would not quite let London go, and would, in its own time, carry you toward peaceful sleep. He moved first, as he so often did, with that small, decisive alteration, of course, that seemed, to the uninitiated, no more than a whim, yet which I had come to recognize as the visible tip of some submerged chain of reasoning. One moment we were proceeding straight along the main thoroughfare, our boots whispering over damp cobbles, and the next, Holmes had turned sharply to the left, cutting into a narrower lane where the fog appeared, if possible, to thicken in quiet welcome. "Not this way, surely," I murmured, drawing my coat a little closer, for the air here had a clammy intimacy, as though the very moisture wished to slip beneath one's collar. "There is nothing but the river warehouses beyond." "On the contrary, Watson," he replied, his tone as soft and unhurried as if we still sat before the fire at Baker Street. "There is, just now, a very great deal beyond." He did not quicken his pace, yet there was a steadiness to his tread that drew me after him, past a shuttered shop window where the fog pressed like a curious face, and toward a darker mouth of alley that opened between two soot-streaked brick walls. It was then that I became aware of the sounds, or rather of the peculiar quality of their absence. London, even in its most muffled moods, rarely surrendered all its noises, yet here the distant rumble of traffic dwindled to a mere suggestion, and in its place there crept to my ears a faint, insistent pattern, a soft hiss, as of air escaping through a narrow valve, a low mechanical whir, steady and self-assured, and most curious of all, a drip of condensed moisture that fell not in random, idle drops, but in a measured cadence, like the ticking of a hidden clock. Holmes paused, head slightly inclined, his profile a pale outline against the grayer mass of fog. "Breathe with me as we begin, Watson," he said quietly, the ghost of that gently wry smile touching his lips. "Natural fog is a charmingly disorderly fellow. It does not, as a rule, consent to gather itself so obediently about human structures, nor to maintain such courteous consistency of depth and density over 3 consecutive nights." I looked about us, seeing only the dim glow of a gas lamp struggling some yards behind, its light swallowed within a few feet as though the air were not merely thick, but intent. "You imply design," I ventured. "Some agency behind this curtain?" He inclined his head. "You will recall, Watson, that I have often described London as my laboratory. Tonight, it appears that someone has taken me at my word and arranged an experiment of their own, an experiment in the manipulation of air and, I suspect, of perception. Weather does not follow a timetable, but men and their machines very much do." We advanced again, the alley bending gently, the fog drawing us onward with the quiet inevitability of sleep. Somewhere ahead, the hiss grew fractionally clearer, the dripping more precise, until, with a slow, almost theatrical courtesy, The mist parted just enough to reveal the looming outline of a large warehouse or factory, its upper windows blind and dark, its lower panes shining through the vapor with a low, unwavering radiance that was neither the flicker of gas nor the homely glow of any ordinary room, but a steady, unnatural light that waited for us, listening. The fog seemed almost to hesitate at the very threshold, as though even it felt the need to ask permission before crossing into that strange, waiting light, and for a moment we simply stood and listened to the quiet pressure of the night around us. Holmes laid his hand upon the wood, and Watson, close beside him, saw the way his long fingers tested the surface before they sought the handle, as a musician might acquaint himself with an unfamiliar instrument. The door was swollen slightly with damp, its planks faintly ridged and furred where the London air had worked at the grain, streaked with old paint that had once aspired to respectability and now peeled away in tired curls. Beneath his touch, the metal handle showed a different character entirely. Cool and beaded with moisture, as if it had been quietly collecting the night upon itself, while the city looked elsewhere. In that small contrast of textures, wood remembering summers past, and metal holding the present chill, Watson felt the whole dockside compressed into Holmes's palm. With a turn that was firm yet unhurried, Holmes drew the latch, and the door answered with a soft groan, not of protest so much as of age, like a sleeper shifting in his bed. The sound slipped into the fog and was swallowed, and then the interior opened before them, a long, dim volume of air, where the outside world did not end so much as thin and rearrange itself. The fog had found its own paths inward, seeping through broken panes high above, trailing in low under the threshold, and gathering in pale pools upon the floor, where it lay like milk poured and forgotten, stirred only by the faintest currents of their breath and movement. Inside, the air bore the smell that clings to such places, a quiet mixture of old wood and older rope, of tar that had long ago surrendered its shine, and of river damp that had crept in with each tide and never quite departed again. Somewhere in the cavernous darkness, a single drop of water fell at intervals, the tiny sound carrying with peculiar clarity, so that each drip seemed to mark not only time but distance, measuring out the unseen rafters above. Their footsteps, though they trod with care, sent low echoes moving through the mostly empty space, doubling and softening around stacked crates and bare beams, until it seemed to Watson that they walked inside the memory of footsteps rather than the thing itself. A thought that would have amused Holmes had he chosen to indulge it. Holmes had secured, by means best known to himself, a small hand lamp from a drowsy watchman at the corner, and now its lantern glow went before them, a modest, steady fire enclosed in glass, casting long, slow-moving shadows that climbed the uprights and slid along the ceiling. The warehouse became, under that light, a quiet, private world, a room the size of a chapel, separated from the city not only by brick and beam, but by a different quality of silence, the sort that soft-spoken tales to slow the day's thoughts might easily inhabit. Outside, London with its gas-lit streets and restless commerce continued. Within, the air seemed to hold its breath, as if the entire structure were listening to the small circle of warmth that advanced across its floor. If you like, you might breathe with me as we begin to follow that glow more closely, the way Watson's gaze did, tracing the way the mist thickened and thinned at its edges, revealing first the blunt corners of anonymous crates, then the loop of a forgotten coil of rope, then the pale rectangle of a half-boarded window that admitted only a suggestion of the night beyond. Every few steps offered some new small discovery, yet all of them shared that same subdued character, as though the warehouse had been carefully emptied of anything that might raise the pulse. It was therefore the more striking when Holmes's light, swinging a fraction wider as he altered his grip, fell at last upon something that did not belong to any ordinary dockside inventory. At the far end of the building, half concealed by swirling mist that clung to it with curious insistence, there rose a low arrangement of pipes and squat metal tanks, their surfaces beaded like the door handle with condensed moisture, their lines too deliberate, too modern, to be dismissed as forgotten machinery. The lamp's reflection traced along a pressure gauge, winked briefly in the curve of a valve and then steadied, while the fog around that apparatus seemed thicker, almost purposeful, as if the very air were being persuaded into patterns. Watson felt, in that moment, the same subtle tightening of attention that comes when a sleeper turns toward the edge of a dream, and he knew, without Holmes needing to say so, that they had found the heart of the matter, though its workings remained, for the present, veiled. The room seemed to narrow around that strange construction, the ordinary clutter of crates and ledgers receding, until there remained only the steady drip of distant water, the soft hiss of the street fog at the window, and the quiet, waiting presence of the machine itself. Watson, who had seen engines of war and engines of healing, found this one oddly domestic in appearance, as though some overzealous householder had attempted to bottle the weather. A row of metal tanks, squat and riveted, stood shoulder to shoulder like sentries, their curved flanks dulled by condensation. From each, a series of coiled pipes rose and bent back upon themselves, looping in tight spirals that reminded him faintly of the copper tubing in a chemist's shop. Only here the scale was larger, more ambitious, more secretive. Low down, half hidden by a wooden screen, a compact boiler crouched, its iron skin still faintly warm to the touch, as if it had only recently surrendered its fire. "Hold the lamp a trifle higher, Watson, if you please," Holmes murmured, his voice so even that it seemed to smooth the very air. Watson obliged, settling his grip, feeling the quiet weight of the lantern handle, the small circle of light expanding to reveal a cluster of valves and stopcocks, each neatly labeled in an engineer's careful hand. The light caught upon a glass reservoir mounted above the tanks, in which a thin, cloudy liquid clung to the sides. A sharp, almost medicinal tang floated up, not unpleasant, but insistent. Holmes leaned in, his thin face composed, the keen gray eyes softened by concentration rather than alarm. He touched one of the pipes with the back of his fingers, then examined a faint whitish crust along the joint. "Ammonium chloride, almost certainly," he said, more to the room than to his companion. "And here, note the faint yellowing upon the brass, suggestive of sulfurous compounds. You perceive, Watson, that we are in the presence of an artificial cloud maker." Watson cleared his throat softly. "You mean, Holmes, that this fog has been cooked?" The word escaped him before he could locate a more dignified term, and he felt, rather than saw, the faintest tremor of amusement pass through his friend's shoulders. "If you wish to adopt culinary metaphors, my dear fellow, then yes," Holmes replied. "London in our time has proved all too willing a kitchen. Coal fires, factory chimneys, the exhaust of river steamers, all have contributed to those pea-soper fogs which the newspapers describe with such weary regularity. It required only a mind both practical and unscrupulously imaginative to reverse the process, to distill the city's miasma into something local, reliable, and above all, controllable." He moved along the apparatus with unhurried care, pointing out a shuttered vent that rose to meet a brick flue, its mouth angled toward the street. Another, narrower duct branched away, disappearing into the wall at a height that suggested a grating at pavement level. "Observe the arrangement," Holmes continued. "A boiler to heat the mixture, tanks to store the reagents, coils to cool and thicken the vapor, and finally these outlets to deliver it precisely where desired. Breathe with me as we begin to consider the implications, Watson. This is no accident of the weather. It is a system." Watson shifted the lamp again, the warm glass almost comforting against his glove. Outside, the fog pressed softly at the window, as though listening. "But to what end?" he asked, keeping his voice low, as if unwilling to disturb the fragile silence. "London has fog enough of her own. Why should any man take the trouble to manufacture more, and for a single street?" Holmes straightened, his profile briefly etched in gold against the dim room. "That, my dear friend, is the question that now concerns us," he said. "For we have passed from conjecture to certainty. This fog has been deliberately generated and carefully maintained. The problem before us is no longer how it is done, but why someone has chosen to wrap this narrow corner of the city in a curtain of secrecy, and what, under that cover, they hope the rest of London will never see." He let the words settle, like fine dust in a shaft of light, inviting the listener to settle in, get comfortable with the knowledge that the mystery had deepened rather than resolved, a soft-spoken tale to slow the day's thoughts even as it opened, gently, into darker possibilities that would carry you toward peaceful sleep only once the final veil was drawn aside. Watson found his gaze returning, again and again, to the faint track of their own shoes on the dusty boards, as if the warehouse itself had become a page on which the night was quietly writing. Holmes, however, had already moved beyond their entrance, his lantern held low, the soft circle of light gliding ahead like a cautious thought venturing into an unfamiliar room. "The floor, Watson," he murmured, and the words were gentle rather than urgent, a tutor reminding a favored pupil of a familiar exercise. The fog pressed at the broken windows above them, muting the city's distant murmur, so that the tiny sounds within, the creak of timber, the soft rasp of their steps, seemed suddenly important. When Watson bent, he saw it at once, not a confusion of marks, but a pattern, deliberate, almost orderly, traced in damp dust and coal grit. There were footprints, certainly, leading to and from the squat machinery that had birthed the artificial fog, broad-soled and narrow, some turning sharply as if at a whispered command, others pacing with the steady rhythm of a man who knows his route so well he need not think about it. Interlaced with these, like musical notation crossing a stave, ran twin lines of wheel marks from small handcarts, the metal rims having scored the floor where the damp had softened it, a quiet testimony to repeated journeys. Here and there, long pale scrapes showed where heavy crates had been dragged rather than lifted, the wood biting through dust to the bare plank beneath. "Observe how the traffic converges," Holmes said, his lantern pausing over a knot of overlapping impressions near a shadowed corner, from the river door to the machine, and thence to the street entrance. "The fog is not merely an experiment, my dear fellow, it is stagecraft." He straightened, and in the warm, measured cadence of his more professorial moods, allowed the explanation to unfurl. Nature, he observed, had already furnished London with nights of honest fog, those old pea supers that had wrapped the city in a damp, yellow silence. Our unknown friends here had merely consulted the program and arranged for an encore on evenings of their own choosing. The corner to which the marks led revealed, when Watson followed, a neat stack of crates, some prized open, their lids leaning like discarded book covers. Foreign markings ran along their sides, blurred but legible. Hamburg, Antwerp, Rotterdam, names that brought with them a faint suggestion of salt air and long, patient voyages up the Thames. Within lay no weapons, no instruments of melodrama, but bales of fine lace, bottles of French spirits with their labels carefully turned inward, and small, tissue-wrapped parcels of perfumes whose corked mouths seemed almost to hold their breath. Goods neither wicked nor innocent, Holmes mused, nearly expensive to introduce to the British public by the sanctioned door. Why pay the taxman when one may enlist the fog? He spoke without heat, as if discussing a chess problem rather than a moral failing. And Watson, listening, felt again that curious blend of admiration and unease which Holmes so often evoked. When London wakes to find another evening smothered in mist, it shrugs, closes the window, and draws nearer to the fire. Meanwhile, a few quiet gentlemen moved their merchandise along a street so kindly concealed that even the constable's lantern becomes a decorative gesture. He invited Watson, and by quiet extension you as well, to settle in with the thought, not of grand conspiracies, but of small, persistent human schemes nesting inside the city's weather like birds in an old chimney. Was it not, Holmes suggested, an oddly elegant thing to borrow the habits of the sky as camouflage, to let a man-made fog pretend to be its elder cousin while crates rolled unseen from river to cart and cart to safer rooms? For a moment, the only sound was the soft tick of cooling metal from the machine and the distant wash of the Thames, a lull in which one might almost, if drowsiness were allowed to creep in, breathe with me as we begin to imagine the case winding gently toward its solution, a soft-spoken tale to slow the day's thoughts. Yet just as Watson's shoulders loosened, there came, very faint but unmistakable, the quiet thud of a door closing somewhere beyond the inner wall, followed by a single cautious footstep overhead. The warehouse, it seemed, had been listening to them all along, and was now preparing its reply. For a moment, the three of them stood listening, Holmes, Watson, and the fog itself, as if the great dim room had drawn in a slow breath and was deciding what to exhale next. The silence that followed was not empty, but thick and watchful, like the pause before a conductor's baton falls. Holmes moved first. "Come, Watson," he murmured, and his voice, though quiet, carried an easy certainty that made argument feel rather like protesting the tide. They passed between the looming shapes of crates and idle machinery, their footsteps softened by a thin bloom of dust, until a narrow stairway emerged from the gloom, its rail damp beneath Watson's fingers, smelling faintly of river air and old iron. At the top, the fog had found a window with cracked panes and slipped in eagerly, curling along the ceiling of a small watchroom. A single oil lamp burned on a crate, its flame struggling against the chill, and beside it sat a man on a stool as if he had been placed there and then forgotten. His features were softened by the vapor, so that his eyes, nose, and mouth seemed to float in it, rearranging themselves each time he shifted. His coat was beaded with moisture, the cloth giving off that mingled scent of smoke and Thames water that belongs particularly to London's riverside. When he spoke, his voice came low and cautious, the vowels flattened by the east end, though Watson thought he heard a northern note tucked away in certain words, like a memory the man had not quite shaken. "You're late," the fellow said, and then, as Holmes stepped fully into the room. "Oh!" Holmes inclined his head with a politeness that might have suited a drawing room rather than this damp little area above the docks. "On the contrary," he replied, "we are exactly on time. It is merely that you were expecting another clock." He let his gaze drift, seemingly idle, to the man's boots. where the leather bore a pale ring of chemical residue above the soles, and then to his hands, stained in the creases with a faint gray that was not quite coal and not quite ash. Watson, watching, felt that familiar mixture of curiosity and comfort, the sense that he could let Holmes conduct the conversation like a soft-spoken tale to slow the day's thoughts. "You've been tending the apparatus downstairs," Holmes continued, almost kindly. "The nozzles along the guttering, the pump near the river wall. A remunerative position, no doubt, for a man whose last honest berth was on a coal barge out of Rotherhithe." The man's shoulders sagged, resistance leaving him as gently as steam from a kettle. "Did they tell you my name as well, sir?" he asked, with a flicker of wryness that Watson could not help but respect. "They did not need to," Holmes said. "Your boots have spoken quite eloquently on your behalf, but names are unimportant. It is the arrangement that interests me. You are paid to keep the machinery running, to thicken the fog along this street at certain hours, and to discourage curious eyes from lingering at the windows. That is all?" The watchman swallowed. "That's all as I was told. Keep it flowing when the bell rings, shut it off when it rings again. Good money for a man as doesn't ask questions. I never seen the one as pays, not proper. Comes in by the side door, leaves the notes in an envelope on the table there. Voice from the dark, that's all I get." Holmes's tone remained almost gentle, as though they discussed the weather. "And the bell? My good fellow, who rings that?" For the first time, the man's gaze slipped past them, drawn upward to a narrow inner window that looked onto some higher room or office at the back of the warehouse, where the fog pressed against the glass like a curious listener. "From up there," he whispered, his damp fingers tightening on the edge of the stool. "When the bell goes, the fog goes with it. And he's up there now." Watson felt, quite distinctly, the room itself seemed to lean in. "Then," Holmes said softly, "we must not keep him waiting, must we?" Watson rose at once, though his knees, still a little stiff from the damp, protested the motion, and climbed those steps with him in your mind. The warehouse below fell away behind them, its smells of rope and river and cold iron softening into a more distant presence with each careful footfall. The staircase was narrow, almost meanly so, the kind of passage that seemed designed for ledgers rather than men, and each wooden tread announced their ascent with a separate, individual creak, as though reluctant to yield. The fog, which had pooled thickly on the warehouse floor, clung to the lower steps, but as they climbed it thinned into a pale veil, a faint haze that drifted and folded back on itself in the dim gaslight, until at last it was no more than a suggestion in the air, a taste of London's restlessness rather than its full smothering presence. Holmes's hand slid once along the rail, leaving a darker streak in the dust. "Few visitors," he murmured. At the top, a short landing turned sharply and delivered them to a door whose paint had cracked into a fine network of lines, like an old map. Holmes's fingers closed on the handle, and for a heartbeat there was that particular quality of silence Watson knew so well, the quiet before a conductor's baton falls. Then the latch yielded, and they stepped into the office above the mist. The room was cramped but notably orderly, the sort of space in which every inch had been persuaded to earn its keep. A solid desk stood beneath a single window, its surface lined with ledgers whose spines showed dates in a neat, unwavering hand. Against one wall hung a large map of London, its familiar sprawl reduced to paper and ink, while in the opposite corner a small iron stove gave off a lingering warmth, the last coals settling with a soft sigh, a domestic echo in an otherwise utilitarian room. The window itself looked out into the fog, which pressed close to the glass and swirled, not in the wild fashion of open air, but in slow, circling eddies, like something thinking. Holmes crossed to the desk at once, his movements quiet but full of purpose. He opened the top ledger and began to turn the pages, his long finger traveling down columns of dates, times, and destinations. River docks, riverside warehouses, anonymous city corners whose names meant little to Watson but seemed to quicken Holmes's attention. "Observe, Watson," he said, tilting the book so that the light fell more kindly upon it. "Shipments recorded here on the very nights our supernatural fog refused to disperse. Scotland Yard blames the weather. The weather, it appears, keeps excellent books. The pattern, once pointed out, was undeniable. Each instance of the lingering fog coincided with a cluster of nocturnal movements, crates received after midnight, deliveries dispatched toward the Thames just before dawn, all threaded through with that same street below, as though the mist itself had become a discreet curtain for commerce that preferred not to be noticed. A soft crackle drew Watson's eye to the stove. Holmes was already there, lifting the small iron door with a cloth-wrapped hand. Inside, amid the red ghosts of coal, lay the curled remains of a letter, half consumed yet stubbornly legible in places where the fire had hesitated. With the delicacy of a surgeon, Holmes teased it free onto the hearth, tapping away ash until the surviving lines emerged. "Adequate cover assured," he read quietly. "Further experiments to proceed as scheduled. The Society expects." The rest dissolved into charred lacework, where the flames had done their more thorough work. One does not speak of cover and experiments in such a room, under such a fog, without inviting inquiry, Watson? There was a gentle, wry note in his voice, as though London itself had made a small joke at their expense, and then waited to see if they would catch it. Watson, feeling the warmth of the stove at his back and the cool breath of fog against the window, became suddenly aware of how quiet the world outside had grown, as if the city had drawn a blanket over its usual sounds. "Do you think this society is local?" he asked. Holmes did not answer at once. Instead, he returned to the map on the wall, his gaze sharpening. Small, precise marks, some in pencil, some pricked with a pin, dotted the paper in a pattern that once seen could not be unseen. Riverside warehouses, secluded alleys, a scattering of seemingly ordinary intersections, all linked if one knew how to look. The street below was merely one point among many, a single node in a quiet constellation. "Breathe with me as we begin to widen our view," I might say to you now, for Holmes's mind was already doing just that. "Here, here, and here," he murmured, touching 3 of the marked locations in turn, his finger lingering slightly longer over a cluster near the Thames. "Our fog is no isolated curiosity, Watson. It is an instrument, deployed with precision. London remains my laboratory, but tonight—" And here his voice softened, almost fond. "The experiment has spread to several rooms. Ta baby!" Watson felt a slow shiver that had nothing to do with the damp. The office, with its modest stove and orderly desk, had become a command post in miniature, suspended above the mist like the cabin of a ship above a clouded sea. Outside, the fog turned once more against the glass, as if impatient. Holmes stood very still before the map, his profile cut in quiet relief against the pale paper. "We shall need," he said at last, "to pay a visit to more than one of these marks before the night is out." His finger rested again on the pin that corresponded to their present street. "This, I fancy, is only the first window onto their operations, and windows, Watson, are meant to be opened." The stove sighed, a final ember settling. Somewhere below, a bell stirred the air. Our soft-spoken tales to slow the day's thoughts would, for the moment, have to share space with a city that refused to sleep, and with a fog that, it seemed, refused to lift until its secret society was satisfied. Yet even as the mystery grew wider, the quiet of that cramped room, the gentle warmth of the stove, and the steady cadence of Holmes's deductions formed their own kind of calm, a strange reassurance that, however wide the network, it was at last coming into view. In that sense, perhaps, the fog was doing them a favor, drawing a soft circle around the night's work, ready to carry you toward peaceful sleep once the final pin on that map had given up its story. Holmes let his hand hover for a moment above the map, the lamplight turning the pins into tiny points of captured dawn. And when he spoke again, his voice had dropped into that softer register that always made Watson lean in without quite realizing he had moved. "London, Watson," he murmured, "is at once my laboratory and my chessboard. Every street a retort in which some experiment of human character is quietly boiling away. Every alley a square upon which a patient hand may move its pieces." The room held its gentle silence, broken only by the soft crackle from the stove and the distant roll of a cab along Baker Street, its wheels half muted by the damp. Holmes's finger began to travel from pin to pin, tracing the crooked constellation they had made together, as if he were following some private star chart laid over London's sleeping roofs. "Observe the spacing," he went on. "Here a dockside warehouse, here a riverside lane, here a modest mews off Marylebone. To the untrained eye, mere coincidence. To one who has spent his life reading this city as you might read the morning paper, there is intention in every gap. Someone has been treating the fog itself as a piece upon the board, moving traffic and darkness as if they were knights and bishops, arranging collisions and clearances with the regularity of a timetable." He tapped 2 pins that marked the river. "On certain nights, only certain nights, the manufactured mist thickens along this curve of the Thames. The barges slow, the watchmen cough, the gas lamps turn the air into a luminous curtain. Shipments arrive at the same hour, disappear along the same alley, and the world, lulled by routine, ceases to question. Crime, my dear fellow, does not always hide in chaos. It very often hides in the comforting repetition of what appears to be ordinary life." Watson watched him with quiet admiration, feeling again that odd blend of friendship and spectatorship, as though he occupied a front-row seat in a small, warm theater whose only performer was this lean figure bending over a map. To Holmes, the city beyond their window was not merely streets and chimneys. It was a text written in fog and footprints, in train whistles and missed appointments, legible only to eyes that had trained themselves to see pattern where others saw only weather. There was, Watson reflected, a kind of gentle arrogance in that gift, softened by the fact that Holmes asked nothing from London but the chance to understand it. These were soft-spoken tales to slow the day's thoughts, told in gaslight and pipe smoke, and yet they carried consequences that reached far beyond their quiet room. Holmes straightened a little, his gaze sharpening without losing its calm. "To comprehend the motive behind this fog," he said, "we must follow it beyond the ledger and the crate. Smuggling is but the surface game. The true issue lies with those whose lives have been bent, delayed, or darkened by this artificial weather. Breathe with me as we begin that next inquiry, Watson, for until we trace the human cost of this experiment, the board, though crowded with pieces, will remain unread." He had scarcely finished speaking when the three of us found ourselves once more at the street door, the dim glow from the warehouse office falling behind us like the last warmth of a dying fire as we stepped into the waiting fog. It received us with that soft, familiar pressure, cool against the face, and yet tonight it seemed almost to lean in and listen, as though London itself were curious what Holmes would do next. Watson, moving in close third person now, noted how the lamps along the pavement had been reduced to pale blurs, each one a small uncertain moon suspended in a private cloud, and how the sounds of the city, never entirely at rest, had fallen to a muffled murmur. A cart rattled somewhere beyond sight. A dog barked once, and then as they walked a little deeper between the shuttered fronts and dripping eaves, the noises thinned and softened until even the river's usual gossip became no more than a gentle, continuous breathing at the edge of hearing. Was it his imagination, he wondered, or did this particular fog know when to hold its tongue? Holmes chose a narrow grocer's shop where a single candle still burned behind a window, its flame pressed close to the glass as if seeking company. Inside, the air held the scent of tea, cheap tobacco, and damp sacking, and the proprietor, a small man with reddened hands and a woolen comforter wound about his throat, looked up with the weary start of one who has not seen a customer in hours. Business, he confessed in a quiet rush once Watson had purchased a packet of biscuits he did not need, had fallen away whenever the fog settled over this stretch. Regulars stayed to the broader thoroughfares, and strangers, if any came, did not linger. Holmes listened more than he spoke, his questions few and precise, like pins placed in a map. At what hour had the fog first begun to behave so? Not merely thick, but strangely stationary. Had there been any unfamiliar smells on those evenings, beyond the usual coal smoke and river damp? And, most gently of all, had the shopkeeper noticed any unusual callers in the past weeks, men who bought nothing, or who seemed more interested in the street than in the shelves? The answers were hesitant, but clear enough to be noted and stored away behind those gray eyes. Outside again, the silence deepened as they walked further from the main road. A cab stood at the corner, horse steaming faintly in the chill, its driver hunched in his greatcoat and staring into the pale wall before him. He refused, with a respectful but immovable shake of the head, to take his vehicle down the fog-bound stretch, explaining that wheels and hooves alike lost their sound there, that the usual clatter vanished and left him feeling, as he put it with a wry twist of the mouth, like a ghost driving a ghost for no fare at all. It was near the river end of the street that they encountered the child, a thin girl with a shawl drawn up over her hair, tracing patterns in the beads of moisture that had gathered on a low window ledge. She told Watson, in the serious tone children reserve for wonders and fears, that the fog was frightening when it crept under doors and made the whole room small, yet beautiful when it turned the lamps to stars, and hid the warehouses so completely that she could pretend the river beyond was the edge of the world. Holmes, crouching slightly to bring his gaze level with hers, asked only whether the fog always came the same way. "Oh, no," she said. Sometimes it waited until a certain gentleman had walked past, tall, with a soft foreign way of speaking, and a coat that smelled, she thought, like the matches the dockmen used. He would appear, always just before the fog thickened, and then the street would grow so quiet that even the river seemed to fall asleep. As they turned back, Watson felt the strange, lulling pull of that silence, and I invite you, listening now, to let these soft-spoken tales to slow the day's thoughts, to let the image of lamplight and careful footsteps carry you toward peaceful sleep, even as Holmes alert within the same quiet. followed that new, nameable presence through the fog toward their next discovery. There is a peculiar comfort, is there not, in the moment when a nameless unease finally accepts a shape, however blurred. And Holmes, walking with Watson back toward the main thoroughfare, allowed that new presence in the fog to acquire outline and habit, and, at last, the faintest suggestion of a face. The residents, once coaxed by his quiet questions, had spoken with the same hesitant agreement one hears when several clocks in different rooms strike the hour within a breath of one another, each confirming the other's time. A man, they said, always a man, always alone. Well-dressed, though in a manner more careful than fashionable, his coat dark and well-brushed, his hat of good felt, his boots leaving narrow, precise impressions even when the street was slick with that lingering mist. Most remembered the cane first, a slender thing with a curious metal ferrule that clicked very softly on the cobbles, as if some inner spring absorbed the weight of each step. Others spoke of a scent, not the rough tang of the river or the sour reek of the docks, but something cleaner, strangely cool, like a faint suggestion of menthol and chemicals escaping from a well-ordered laboratory. All, without exception, recalled the same small, repeated gesture. He would pause at the corner, draw out a watch on a fine chain, consult it with almost ceremonial attention, and then step forward into the thickest part of the fog and be gone. "Regularity," Holmes murmured, as they turned back toward the warehouse with its dim blind windows, "is the handwriting of intention." Inside, in that echoing room where the fog pressed itself through broken panes and slow, curling fingers, he spread the ledgers once more upon the crate they had commandeered as a table. The columns of figures and dates lay under his long hands with a kind of reluctant clarity. And Watson, watching, felt again that sense of London as Holmes's private laboratory. Every page another beaker, every smudge of ink a trace reaction. Holmes moved no faster than the soft drift of the fog beyond the door, yet the pattern emerged with the same inevitability with which night gathers at a window. Here a date, there an hour, here an unexplained entry of chemicals received, there a notation of coal deliveries oddly out of proportion to any honest trade. He marked them with the tip of his pencil, and the marks, Watson saw, fell upon the very nights the residents had named, those evenings when the fog had been not merely thick, but possessed of that uncanny persistence, clinging to one street while others cleared. "You see, Watson," he said at last, "this gentleman of the invisible hour keeps better appointments than most physicians. He comes only when the fog is at its most pronounced, and the warehouse breathes in more than it could possibly require." Watson, who had been tracing the dates in his own slower fashion, felt the soft prickle of unease along his neck. "Then he is a smuggler," he said, though even as he spoke the word it seemed too small, like trying to dress a winter gale in the summer coat. Chemicals, perhaps, brought in under cover of the weather. There is profit in that, no doubt, and secrecy, and yet, he hesitated, aware of Holmes's profile still as a carving against the dim light. "You spoke of intention. Might a man not also intend something beneficent? Some misguided philanthropy, an experiment to cleanse the air, to tame the fog for the city's good?" Holmes's shoulders moved in the faintest suggestion of a shrug, a gesture that in him often meant more than any emphatic denial. "There are circles in London," he replied, "for whom the atmosphere itself is a subject of study. Meteorological societies, chemical associations, private clubs where gentlemen discuss the temperament of the Thames and the disposition of coal smoke with more passion than they grant their own households. It would not astonish me to find our friend numbered among such a company." Nor would it astonish me to find that his interest in the urban climate is practical. The pause before that last word was so slight that only Watson, and perhaps you listening now, would have heard it. He thought of certain societies they had encountered before, of secretive gatherings in back rooms where scientific curiosity and private ambition had formed uneasy alliances, like two strangers sharing the same narrow bench in a cab. Then his motive might be profit, Watson persisted gently. If he has found a way to sell clearer air to those who can afford it, or to charge for the concealment the fog provides, or secrecy, if he wishes his experiments to pass unnoticed, or even a kind of philanthropy gone astray, if he believes he serves the city by mastering its weather. The ideas sounded strange in his own ears, yet London, with its endless capacity for oddities, made them seem no more impossible than a train vanishing in a tunnel or a diplomat stepping out of a locked room. Holmes closed the ledger with a soft, decisive motion that raised a whisper of dust, like the quietest possible sigh. "We have, I think, narrowed our field to a single figure," he said, "but not yet to a single truth. A man who walks by the clock, who carries the fog with him as another might carry a lantern, who deals in substances the common dockworker cannot name, and whose comings and goings coincide with a phenomenon that has set an entire street on edge. We possess his outline, his timetable, his probable connections, and yet there remains one fact, one small but essential fact, that refuses to declare itself. Outside, the river gave a muted slap against the pilings, and somewhere in the deeper fog a bell sounded the hour with a muffled melancholy, as though even time itself were wrapped in wool. Holmes listened, his head slightly bent, and then turned toward the door with that sudden decision which always made Watson feel, for a moment, as though the room itself had shifted around them. "Come, Watson," he said, drawing up the collar of his coat against the damp. "These walls have told us all they presently know. The remainder must be coaxed from reflection. We shall return to Baker Street, where the air, though not free of this infernal vapor, is at least familiar, and where the fire and our old chairs may yet encourage the mind to arrange these scattered impressions into order. It is in the quiet of our own room that patterns are most apt to reveal themselves, like writing appearing under the flame of a candle." As they stepped back into the mist, the street seemed to close around them with its usual soft indifference, and yet, as Watson glanced once more toward the warehouse and saw, or thought he saw, the faintest glow at an upper window, as though someone had been watching their departure with careful interest, he could not help but wonder whether the gentleman of the invisible hour already knew they were coming home. The cab carried us back through streets that seemed narrower for the fog, as though London were drawing its curtains for the night, and when at last the familiar outline of Baker Street swam up out of the gray, I felt a quiet easing in my chest that no bravado could quite conceal. It is one thing to chase enigmas through dim warehouses and watching windows, and another, far softer thing, to step once more beneath the modest arch of 221B and smell the remembered warmth of home. Inside, the contrast was almost tender. The fog pressed itself against the window panes like a rebuffed collar, while within, the room glowed with the mild, steady light of the shaded lamps and the deeper living radiance of the fire, which had sunk to a bed of coals that whispered rather than crackled. The air carried that mingled scent I had come to associate with our evenings together. Pipe tobacco, a trace of chemicals from one of Holmes's more subdued experiments, and the faint, comforting dust of books whose pages had been turned in 100 quiet hours of shared silence. Holmes shrugged off his coat with an absent motion and took up his accustomed position upon the sofa, his long figure folding into that curious attitude of repose which suggested to the uninitiated languor, and to those who knew him, a mind tightening its focus. He filled his pipe with deliberate care. Then, as he struck a match, the small flare lit the angles of his face before surrendering to the room's softer glow. Soon the smoke rose in slow blue-gray spirals, curling upward to the ceiling in gentle imitation of the fog outside, yet tamed here, domesticated, a thinking man's weather rather than the city's blind breath. "Come, Watson," he murmured, with that hint of indulgence he reserved for my narratives. "Let us see what picture your excellent memory can paint of our gentleman of the invisible hour." I drew my chair a little nearer the fire, feeling the day's dampness retreat from my bones, and began, as I so often did, to put our steps into order, more for my own benefit than his, and perhaps, if you will forgive the confession, to hear how the case sounded when spoken aloud. I recalled the first evening when we had stood at this very window, watching the strange, unmoving bank of fog that clung to that single London street while the rest of the city breathed and shifted as usual. Scotland Yard had shrugged and blamed the weather. Holmes, with a faint lift of the eyebrow, had observed that weather did not, as a rule, keep appointments. Then had come the reports. The sudden silences within that shrouded stretch, the muffled cries that never quite resolved into words, the sense, repeated by every witness, that the deeper one walked into the whiteness, the more London itself seemed to fall away. As I spoke of the warehouse by the river, of the dockside whispers about accursed mist, of the subtle comings and goings timed to the thickest hours of the night, Holmes's pipe sent up its quiet signals, each exhalation a small punctuation mark in the air. From time to time he interjected, never unkindly, but with that precise touch of correction that nudged my account from impression toward structure. Where I said, for instance, that the fog had appeared 3 nights in succession, he gently substituted "was induced," and when I described the men at the docks as fearful of superstition, he added, "or of discovery," in a tone that left no doubt which he considered the truer motive. "You omit, my dear fellow," he observed at one point, "the most telling element, that the warehouses most deeply swathed in this obliging cloud are those whose ledgers show the greatest discrepancy between goods declared and goods received." It was like watching a sketch acquire depth and shadow. My narrative, which had wandered a little among impressions of sound and light, of damp cobbles and glimmering gas, gradually resolved under his guidance into a chain of cause and effect, each link cool, clear, and undeniable. For a moment, as I paused to marshal the next sequence of events, the room seemed to rest. The fire breathed softly. The clock upon the mantel marked out the seconds with a calm domestic insistence, and the smoke from Holmes's pipe hung in delicate wreaths above him, like thoughts not yet spoken. One could almost, in such a moment, forget that outside our window the city was wrapped in its strange selective shroud. Then came the small pattern interrupt that so often signaled a turn in his reasoning. Without any change in his posture, Holmes's gaze drifted away from me and toward the glass, where the lamplight made a faint golden circle against which the lingering fog pressed, thin but stubborn, as if reluctant to relinquish its hold upon that distant, haunted street. His eyes, which a moment before had been half-lidded in apparent indifference, sharpened with that peculiar inward brightness I had learned to recognize. "You see, Watson," he said quietly, almost as if speaking to himself, "we have been asking what the fog conceals, what crimes, what movements, what faces it allows to pass unnoticed. But the true question is subtler, and therefore more promising. Not merely what does it hide, but whom does it protect? He let the words hang there, light as smoke and yet curiously weighty, and in the soft silence that followed, with the fire low and the room wrapped in its own gentle warmth, I had the distinct sensation that we were no longer merely observers at our window, but that London itself, in all its sleeping complexity, was slowly turning to show us another of its guarded profiles. "So," he murmured at last, drawing one final thoughtful breath from his pipe, "breathe with me as we begin to think not of a cursed street, but of a carefully chosen curtain. There is a hand behind this weather, Watson, and it is not the hand of chance." These are soft-spoken tales to slow the day's thoughts, perhaps, but the mind behind that mist is wide awake, and until we understand whom it seeks to shelter, we shall not sleep as soundly as this room would suggest we might. And with that, while the fog outside thinned and thickened in slow, mysterious pulses, Holmes's gaze remained fixed upon the window, as though somewhere beyond the dim reflection of our own hearth, the answer were already forming in the restless, thinking air of London. In that gentle pause, with the city muffled and the fire low, it was easy to believe that this case, like the smoke above us, would soon unwind itself into clarity, and that the very fog which had seemed to baffle us would, in the end, carry us toward peaceful sleep by revealing not only what it had hidden, but the quiet human purpose for which it had so faithfully stood guard. Holmes had been sitting quite still, his long fingers steepled, his gaze not on the fire nor on me, but on that dim pane of glass where the room's warmth met the city's damp breath. When he spoke, it was with the air of a man merely continuing a conversation that London itself had begun. "Our courteous visitor of this afternoon, Watson," he murmured, "is not, as he would have us believe, a mere dabbler in meteorology. He is a minor industrialist of some consequence, and a scientist of greater ambition, whose published pamphlets on air currents and urban ventilation you may recall ignoring in last year's Times." I started, for I had indeed seen the name, and in a moment of private honesty that I would not willingly have confessed, skimmed past the dense columns in favor of the cricket scores. Holmes's lip curved, not unkindly, as if he had followed that little act of treason against science from across the breakfast table. "He has long agitated," Holmes continued, "for schemes to cleanse, redirect, and even in his more soaring passages, to tame the city's choking mists. London to him is a laboratory whose consent he has not thought it necessary to obtain." The notion that this same man had contrived the stubborn fog that wrapped one street and left its neighbors clear seemed at first to place him neatly among the rogues and smugglers of the riverside. Holmes disabused me of that comforting simplicity with the same quiet thoroughness with which he knocked the ash from his pipe. "He has used his device," my friend explained, "both as curtain and crucible. Certain goods have passed unobserved from lighter to warehouse, it is true. Yet in the same breath, he has been measuring, adjusting, learning how a forced current may sweep away the very coal smoke that blackens your patient's lungs." It was a curious thing to picture. The same apparatus that cloaked illicit cargo also, in his mind serving to lift the yellow, poisonous veil from over a schoolyard or a hospital ward. The fire sank a little, and in the lengthening silence I found myself turning the matter over with a discomfort that did not easily settle. Was he then a scoundrel hiding behind equations, or a reformer who had allowed profit and secrecy to fog his own moral sight? Holmes, who could read my thoughts as readily as the evening paper, let me wrestle with the question for a time, as though he knew that some conclusions must be reached slowly if they are to hold. "You see the difficulty," he said at last. his voice one of those soft-spoken tales to slow the day's thoughts rather than to inflame them. Here is a man who genuinely detests the city's filth, who dreams not entirely without merit, of channels and towers and unseen currents that might one day sweep these streets clear, and yet he chooses, for reasons of finance, impatience, and a certain scientific vanity, to ally his invention with the oldest trade of the river. I recalled the docks we had walked through, the fog making lanterns into floating moons, and the Thames into a black ribbon of suggestion, and it struck me that London herself was forever producing such men, neither wholly villainous nor remotely saintly, but drifting somewhere between, like barges whose ropes had been loosed in the dark. To condemn him outright felt easy. To excuse him entirely felt like a betrayal of those honest captains and clerks whose livelihoods his smugglers undercut. Justice Holmes, I ventured, will hardly pause to weigh such fine shades when once the yard has its hand upon him. Holmes nodded, his profile sharp against the fogged window, where the city's glow turned the mist to a faint aureole. "The law, my dear Watson, must attend to the deed," he replied, "for without that solid anchor we should all drift." Yet intention and the possible worth of his research make the harbor to which that law should steer him less obvious than you might wish. We shall, of course, place the facts where they belong. But how society chooses to treat a man who has tried, clumsily and wrongly, to bend the fog for both gain and good, that is a question which even Scotland Yard cannot answer alone. He fell quiet then, and for a little while we simply listened to the muffled city, to the soft hiss of the gas, and to the low, companionable crackle of the fire, as if the room itself were considering what mercy and what firmness might mean in a world where even the mist could be engineered. If you breathe with me as we begin to follow Holmes into that moral weather, you may find, as I did, that certainty is sometimes the first thing to vanish when the fog at last begins to lift. And so the evening carried us outward, from that warm room and its thoughtful fire, into the city where the fog had first been taught to obey a timetable. The summons, when it came, was of Holmes's own arranging, a quiet note dispatched through a messenger who knew the back doors of laboratories as well as he knew the front steps of gentlemen's clubs, and it named an hour and a place that our unseen adversary already favored as his observing post. The street itself had grown familiar to us by then, a narrow rib of London not far from the river, where the lamps made only pale islands in a sea of grey, and where on previous nights the fog had hung with that strange, almost thinking stillness that had first set Holmes's mind to work. Tonight, as we waited beneath a leaning window with a cracked pane that whistled faintly in the damp air, there was the same soft curtain of vapor, but it felt, to my perhaps overtired senses, less assured of its own permanence. "Settle in, get comfortable," Holmes murmured, not to me, but as if to the street itself, his gloved hand resting lightly on his cane, his profile cut in dim relief against the nearest gas lamp. The figure who approached us did so without haste, a man in a dark overcoat, his collar turned up, his step that of one who expects to be alone with his thoughts and his experiment. When he saw Holmes, he stopped only a moment, as if he had anticipated this outcome all along and merely regretted the timing. "You have interfered," he said, with no more heat than one might expend on a mislaid ledger. Holmes inclined his head. "I have concluded an experiment of my own," he replied, his voice as quiet as the fog around us. "From the telegram that spoke of a cursed street where sound itself went to sleep, to the machinery beneath the cobbles that I found by following the pattern of gas main repairs From your ledgers at the dockside office that recorded coal and chemical shipments under too many names, to the residents' stories of nights when breathing felt first miraculously easy and then suddenly quite impossible. Each detail, you see, insisted upon a human hand. As he spoke, I noticed the fog begin to loosen, the edges of the lamp sharpening, the far end of the street emerging like a sketch being inked. Whether it was the timed cessation of the hidden pumps Holmes had disabled an hour before, or merely a shift in the weather's own slow thinking, I could not say. But the symbolism was almost too neat, and I saw the other man register it with a weary, wry curl of the mouth. "You speak as if I were some melodramatic sorcerer," he said. "I am an engineer, Doctor. I have watched men cough themselves into early graves because London's air is a slow poison. I merely propose to concentrate the poison where it could be measured, to learn its ways, and then to cleanse it. But London will not change for a pamphlet. It must be shown." There was arrogance there, certainly, but also a genuine, almost desperate frustration, the kind that grows in rooms where windows cannot be opened without admitting more smoke than air. Holmes studied him with that curious blend of sympathy and steel that I had seen on only a few occasions. "The courts," he said at last, "will consider both the harm you have done and the potential good in your calculations. They may even, in time, adopt some portion of your methods in a safer form. But secrecy and the endangerment of others cannot be excused, however noble the equation you write upon the fog." He paused, letting the thinning mist move between them like a slowly drawn curtain. "London is not your laboratory alone." The man's shoulders sank, as if some internal scaffolding had been quietly removed, and in the new clarity of the street I could see for the first time the fine dust of his trade clinging to his cuffs. Somewhere behind us a door opened, letting out a spill of lamplight and the distant sound of a watchman's tread, and I found myself wondering, not for the first time that night, whether the city would thank us for what we were about to do, or whether it would simply find some new way to dream through its own smoke. Holmes turned slightly, as if listening to a signal only he could hear, and in that small movement I sensed that the true heart of the matter, the part that would not yield so easily to clear air, was only now beginning to show itself. He had, I realized, been listening for something to end, or perhaps, more precisely, for something to let go. It began so quietly that, had we not been standing in the very heart of that manufactured cloud, we might have missed the change altogether. The fog did not flee, it loosened, the way a hand relaxes its grip on a curtain cord, and the dense whiteness around us grew first grainy, then thin, until the lamps at the far end of the street ceased to be mere smudges and became once more distinct. Modest circles of soft, yellow light. The engineers at the hidden apparatus working under Lestrade's watchful eye turned valves and closed shutters with the care of men banking down a fire for the night. And as each wheel stilled, as each pipe rattled, and then fell into silence, the air itself seemed to grow lighter, easier to draw into the lungs, no longer thick with that faint metallic tang which had clung to the back of the throat. Distant sounds which the fog had swallowed so greedily began to return in stages. The muted roll of a cab along the next thoroughfare, the call of a newspaper boy somewhere beyond the river, the low, ever-present murmur of London thinking aloud to itself. One by one, doors opened along the terrace, first by an inch, then a cautious hand's breadth, until whole figures emerged, shawls clutched close, nightcaps peering from upper windows, faces turned upward to watch their own street reassemble. Brick by brick and lamp by lamp, out of the thinning vapor, the houses came back first, their familiar lines stepping gently into view, then the iron railings with their glistening points, then the cobblestones underfoot, shining with leftover moisture, each stone catching the lamplight, as though the road itself had been freshly washed. Beyond the last row of buildings, the river declared itself in a sudden, quiet gleam, a strip of moving darkness edged with silver, and above it, where there had been only a low, glowing ceiling of fog, a pale, surprised moon and 2 or 3 shy stars looked down, as if checking whether they were, in fact, expected. Holmes and I stood a little to one side, half in shadow, like 2 latecomers lingering at the back of a theater while the stagehands strike the scenery. He made no speech, claimed no credit. He merely watched, hands loosely folded behind him, as the great curtain of vapor lifted from his chosen laboratory. There was, I fancied, a certain wry satisfaction in his profile, but also that remote look which told me his thoughts were already moving beyond the mechanics of pipes and fans to subtler currents. "Remarkable," I murmured, more to myself than to him, "how quickly a street forgets that it was ever hidden." He inclined his head, neither agreeing nor disagreeing, his gaze following a child who had slipped past an anxious mother to stamp delightedly in a small, shining puddle. Somewhere in an upper room, a window was raised, and the quiet exclamation that drifted down spoke of simple gratitude for clear air and a view restored. These are the soft-spoken tales to slow the day's thoughts, I found myself thinking. Not the dramas of gunfire and pursuit, but the gentle, almost domestic revelations, a lamppost reappearing, a neighbor recognized, the reassuring outline of one's own door. The fog, which had brooded over us with such apparent intention, had seemed in those earlier hours almost alive, a sentient presence pressing against skin and thought alike. Yet here it was now, exposed as nothing more than another human-made veil, impressive in its ingenuity, troubling in its purpose, but ultimately temporary, already thinning into stray tatters above the chimneys, already no more than a dampness in the air that would, in time, carry us toward peaceful sleep. As the last coils drifted up and away, I could not help but wonder, as perhaps you do, what other veils might yet hang over London, unseen, waiting only for the right mind to part them. Breathe with me, as we begin to follow Holmes toward that deeper, less visible mist. And so, almost before one quite knew how the streets had rearranged themselves, we were back in Baker Street, the cab's wheels giving a last tired rattle, and then yielding to that deeper London silence that belongs only to very late hours and very small rooms. The fog outside had thinned to a mere suggestion at the window, a pale veil rather than a wall, and beyond it the gas lamps burned steadily, no longer haloed in mystery, but in a soft workmanlike glow. "My dear Holmes," Watson said at length when the ticking of the clock and the crackle of the coal had had their say, "for the sake of my notes, and perhaps my conscience, might you take me through it once more from the beginning? I confess that certain turns in this affair still lie in a little private fog of their own." Holmes's gray eyes glinted with quiet amusement. "Willingly, Watson. It is no bad thing before sleep to put one's thoughts in order. We began, you will recall, with that single obstinate fact, a fog that clung to one street and one alone, while the rest of London breathed freely. Weather does not respect property lines, so we looked for intention where others saw accident." He spoke slowly, almost lazily, yet each step fell into place. There were the chemical traces on the brickwork and the cobbles, faint but unmistakable to a trained nose and a patient reagent. The hidden machinery humming behind the warehouse wall, feeding its ghostly breath into the night. The ledgers that turned out to be as revealing as any confession, columns of figures marching quietly toward an uncomfortable truth. There was the watchman, whose memory improved in direct proportion to the warmth of the tea provided, and the pattern of late-night visits from the supposed philanthropist, whose concern for public health extended exactly as far as his patents. Each piece alone, Holmes continued, might have been dismissed, a curious fog, a smudge of residue, a few irregular entries, but together they formed a design. Not a curse, not a miracle of nature, but a deliberate experiment conducted upon an unsuspecting street. Watson shifted, the firelight catching the troubled set of his features. And yet, he murmured, our man did not intend harm in the ordinary sense. He sought cleaner air, safer lungs, and stumbled instead into panic, illness, and near ruin. How are we to judge a mind that means to do good but chooses such secret methods? Holmes was quiet for a moment, and the room seemed to listen with them. Intent, Watson, is the color of a deed, but consequence is its weight. The law concerns itself chiefly with the latter. My task is to observe both. Here we had no desire for gain, no wish to injure, only an impatience with the slow machinery of public reform, and a willingness to use a living street as a laboratory. That is why I pressed for restraint rather than ruin. London has always experimented with its own air. Coal fires, factory chimneys, gas lamps, now chemical contrivances, and it will go on doing so with or without our approval. He leaned back, the glow from the fire drawing soft lines along his profile. I am no more than a custodian of the balance, my dear fellow. When the city's experiments threaten to swallow the innocent, I interfere. When they merely inconvenience the guilty, I take notes. The fog will rise again, in one form or another. Our business is to see that, when it does, those who walk home late may still find their doors, their beds, and, if they are fortunate, a quiet room in which to sleep. Outside, a cab passed, its wheels whispering on the damp street, and the last of the night's mist pressed one gentle hand against the glass, as if to listen. For now, at least, London exhaled easily. Inside, the quiet of the room gathered itself again, like a soft shawl drawn closer around tired shoulders, and the small world of Baker Street resumed its gentle breathing. The fog at the window might press and listen, but in here the air held only cool warmth, old books, and the familiar murmur of two men who had, for this night at least, earned their rest. The fire had sunk to a low, steady glow, a bed of embers rather than a blaze, yet it cast a kindly light that touched the curve of Holmes's profile, the edge of Watson's notebook, the worn arms of their chairs, and the carpet that had recorded so many restless footsteps. In that soft radiance, the sitting room showed its true nature, not the stage of grand deductions and breathless pursuits, but a lived-in room whose furniture had sagged into comfort, whose curtains held the faint scent of London fog and tobacco, whose very walls seemed to remember every case more clearly than some of the clients who had brought them. Watson sat with his legs stretched toward the fire, pen moving in an unhurried hand across the page, the only sound the gentle scratch of nib on paper and the occasional, almost apologetic, pop from the coals. Every so often he paused, not because he lacked words, but because he wished to choose them well, to do justice to the curious peace that followed. Danger kept at a distance, mysteries resolved, and London once more breathing evenly beyond the glass. Without comment, Holmes's long arm reached for the teapot that had drifted dangerously close to cold, and, with the same precision he might apply to a chemical reagent, he refilled Watson's cup. The gesture was so ordinary, so entirely domestic, that it might have passed unnoticed by a stranger. Yet Watson, who noticed more than he ever admitted aloud, inclined his head in a small, grateful bow, feeling the quiet warmth of the porcelain seep into his fingers, as if the room itself had pressed reassurance into his hands. A moment later, it was Watson who rose, the blanket that had slipped from Holmes's knees gathered and restored with a doctor's absent-minded efficiency. Holmes made a faint sound of protest that was not quite a word, more habit than objection, and allowed the adjustment to stand. Outside, a distant cab called briefly to the Stones. Inside, the blanket settled, the fire breathed, and the clock on the mantel kept its patient count of the night. "Do you ever tire of setting me down in such colors, Watson?" Holmes asked at last, his eyes half closed, his voice carrying that wry undertone that could so easily be mistaken for indifference. "One might suppose from your pages that I live perpetually in the midst of swirling fog and moral drama, rather than in this somewhat untidy room with an over-sentimental historian at my elbow." Watson smiled, the words warming him more than the tea. "If there is sentiment, Holmes, it is the city's, not mine," he answered, though he knew, and Holmes knew, that this was only partly true. "I merely record what I see, and tonight I see London safe, and you." He hesitated, searching for a phrase that would not sound too earnest, temporarily at leisure. "That is a condition I am always grateful to observe." Holmes's gaze slid toward him, the faintest spark of amusement lighting his gray eyes. "Gratitude ill suits you, my dear fellow," he murmured. "You make me sound like a benevolent institution. Still, I confess, there are worse fates than to be curated by so loyal a pen." His glance dropped to the notebook. "Left entirely to myself, I might almost forget that these nights possess their own charm." There was more in the words than the surface allowed, and Watson heard it, just as Holmes knew he would. For all the teasing there lay in the remark an acknowledgment of companionship, of the peculiar comfort of sharing a room whose silences were never empty. He thought, not for the first time, that solitude had never quite managed to reclaim Holmes, while 221B held 2 chairs by the fire, instead of 1. "Then we shall continue to catalogue them," Watson said softly, more to the room than to his friend. "These intervals between storms." He set his pen down, let his hand rest for a moment on the closed cover of the notebook, and allowed himself the small luxury of simply sitting, of feeling the quiet settle around them like a well-worn coat. "So, if you are listening now, settle in, get comfortable, and let this same quiet room hold you for a while. These are soft-spoken tales to slow the day's thoughts, and if they can carry you toward peaceful sleep as surely as they carry us toward the end of another case, then the night has done double duty." Holmes made no reply, though Watson sensed the familiar alertness still coiled somewhere beneath his apparent repose, as if the city might at any moment send up another strange signal through the fog. Yet even that readiness did not disturb the peace. It simply existed alongside it, like a violin resting in its case, strings silent but tuned. The clock ticked on, each second a gentle footstep into the small hours, while beyond the window London murmured in its ordinary key at last, no longer muffled by unnatural vapor, no longer holding its breath. In time, their conversation thinned to the occasional shared glance, then to nothing at all. Words became unnecessary. Presence was sufficient. The fire whispered itself lower. The tea cooled. The notebook lay quiet upon the table. In the soft half-light of the room, two figures sat in companionable silence, one half drowsing, the other wakeful but at ease. And the night went about its slow, unremarkable business. Somewhere in the street below, a milk cart rattled faintly, heralding the earliest edge of morning. Holmes's eyes flickered once toward the window, as if noting the change in the city's rhythm, then closed again. Watson, feeling his own lids grow heavy, let his gaze rest for a final moment on the familiar line of his friend's face, on the blanket, on the fire, and felt that deep, unspoken gratitude that such scenes still existed to be witnessed. The clock ticked. The embers glowed. London breathed. And in the quiet heart of Baker Street, the long night's work gave way at last to simple, shared rest. The clock ticked. The embers glowed. London breathed. And as that shared rest settled over Baker Street, the city beyond their windows seemed to exhale as well, trading the strange, stubborn fog of the night's adventure for something gentler, more natural. The kind of faint mist that simply softens the edges of lamp and river rather than trying to hide them. Out beyond the familiar facade of 221B, the streets of Marylebone lay quieter now, the last cabs fewer and farther between, hoofbeats muffled to a soft, intermittent rhythm that came and went like the slow turning of a page, and above them the sky, whether veiled in a thin haze or briefly clear between passing clouds, watched with that indifferent patience that cities learn over centuries. The Thames moved on in its steady, unseen dark, bearing the reflections of gas lamps and warehouse windows downstream toward morning, as if it were carrying the day's remaining worries away on its surface, out toward the sea where even London's troubles must eventually thin and fade. Inside, the fire's warmth held the rooms in a quiet embrace, and Watson, drifting at the edge of sleep in his chair, felt that peculiar contentment that comes only when a problem has been honestly met and thoroughly solved. When the mind has no further excuse to pace the floor, the fog that had once seemed to think and brood outside their window was now only weather again, stripped of its mystery, its menace dissolved into ordinary damp air and a few lingering curls of smoke from distant chimneys. And there was a comfort in that, a reminder that not every darkness conceals a secret, and not every secret needs to be carried into the night. If you wish, you may settle in, get comfortable, and imagine yourself in that quiet London room, a guest bed made up in the small spare room at the back of the flat, a blanket drawn up, the door left slightly ajar so that the soft murmur of the sitting room reaches you without intruding. Through the window, the city's sounds have grown distant and low. A carriage here, a closing door there, the faint, almost imagined hiss of gas in the street lamps. And you lie there listening as London settles, feeling the curious reassurance of being indoors while such a vast organism breathes and rearranges itself just beyond the glass. The mystery has been seen through to its end. The strange fog has lifted. Nothing remains unfinished that requires your attention. Whatever questions the day has left you with, whatever half-formed worries hover at the edge of your thoughts, they have no place in this room, no business in this bed, and they can wait, as even Holmes allows certain problems to wait until morning. For now, these are only soft-spoken tales to slow the day's thoughts, to carry you toward peaceful sleep rather than keep you from it. And if your mind is not yet ready to let go, if you find yourself still awake, you might simply notice your breathing, gentle and regular, as steady as the river's flow through the sleeping city, in and out, each breath a small, quiet lantern moving along a darkened street, until by degrees too slight to mark, even the last images of London at night begin to dim, to drift, to slip softly into the background, where dreams can take them up and rearrange them without effort or concern. So, breathe with me as we begin to leave Baker Street behind, not with any sudden farewell, but with the slow closing of a well-loved book, the final glow of the fire, and the knowledge that London sleeps, and so, very soon, may you. And before that book closes entirely, before the last ember in the grate of Baker Street fades to a soft, remembering glow, I have a quiet question to leave on the mantelpiece of your thoughts, something you do not need to answer now, or even soon, but which may drift back to you on some later evening when the fog outside your own window feels just a little thicker than usual. If you could spend one foggy night in London with Holmes and Watson, just a single wandering stretch of hours between the last omnibus and the first pale hint of dawn, where would you choose to go first? Would you settle in, get comfortable by the fire in the sitting room of 221B, listening to the faint rattle of cabs below and the scratch of Holmes's bow upon the violin, while Watson dozes with the medical journal slipping from his hand? Or would you ask them, with a certain tentative boldness, to take you down to the river docks, where the lamps hang low and yellow over the Thames, and the water carries the city's secrets under bridges lost in mist? Perhaps you would prefer a gas-lit alley, one of those narrow passages that Conan Doyle loved, where the cobblestones remember more footsteps than any living constable, and where the fog collects in doorways and along window ledges as if it were listening in. Or perhaps, being your own sort of detective, you would choose somewhere else entirely, an all-night tea room near Charing Cross, a bookshop whose owner never quite closes, even an empty railway platform where the silence is so complete that the distant clank of shunted carriages sounds almost like a heartbeat. There is no correct choice, of course. London, on such a night, would belong to you. If, on some later, more wakeful morning or afternoon, you feel like sharing that choice, you are very welcome to leave it in the comments, to tell me whether you would sit by the Baker Street fire or walk beside the veiled water of the Thames, whether you would follow Holmes into the fog or remain in the warm, lamplit room with Watson. There is no expectation, no tally kept, only the quiet pleasure of knowing where your imagination wanders when the city grows still, as sleep loosens the day's knots, that your mind drifts to other strange weather mysteries. A snowbound train stalled somewhere in the Alps, its windows frosted while the passengers whisper. A heatwave night in London when open windows turn every room into a listening post. A sudden summer storm that breaks over the city just as a clue is revealed. These are the sorts of soft-spoken tales to slow the day's thoughts that may, one by one, find their way into future journeys with Holmes and Watson, waiting patiently until you are ready to board. If you choose, at some point, to subscribe, it simply means that those longer, atmospheric adventures will be there whenever you need company or rest, like a familiar book on a bedside table, or a lamp left low in a hallway, so that the room beyond is easy to find. It is only an open door, never a summons, and you do not need to remember any of this now, neither comments nor subscriptions nor future storms and snowfalls. If your eyelids are heavy and the pull of sleep is stronger than the pull of London streets, then let that be your only case tonight, and allow this fog and this story to carry you toward peaceful sleep. If you are still with me in this soft London night, somewhere between waking and dreaming, then allow me to say, quite plainly and without any deduction at all, that I am grateful you chose to be here. In a world that tugs at your sleeve from a dozen directions at once, the decision to settle in, get comfortable, and spend a long, quiet hour in the fog with Holmes and Watson is no small courtesy. You have given your time, your attention, and perhaps even the last clear minutes of your day to this room, this fire, this drifting case of a fog that would not lift, and that is a kind of trust I do not take lightly. Whether you pressed play intending to follow every clue, or simply hoped these soft-spoken tales to slow the day's thoughts would blur the edges of your worries, you have shared this little corner of Baker Street with us. And if, as is very likely, you have slept through half of it already, that is perfectly in order. The mind has its own ways of listening. Even when your eyes are closed and your thoughts have loosened, there is a part of you that notices the quiet rise and fall of voices, the imagined tap of Holmes's footsteps as he crosses the room, the distant rumble of a cab along a fog-drowned street, the faint hiss of a gas lamp outside the window. Who is to say that your thoughts have not been wandering London while you rest,